I'm going to tell you a story about one of the most disturbing killers in American history. A man so consumed by madness, delusion, and violence that his crimes would shock even hardened detectives. This is not the story of a cunning criminal mastermind or a calculated predator hiding behind charm. Instead, it is the story of a man who descended into pure insanity, who believed his body was rotting from the inside, who thought that only blood could keep him alive, and who turned Sacramento, California, into a place of fear in the late 1970s. This is the story of Richard Trenton Chase, the man who became known as the Vampire of Sacramento. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. From the beginning, his childhood was marked by instability. His father was strict, often violent, while his mother was cold and emotionally detached. Richard grew up in an environment where affection was scarce, discipline was harsh, and psychological scars were already forming. As a child, he showed early warning signs of trouble. He was withdrawn, shy, and prone to strange behavior. Teachers noticed he rarely connected with other children and instead lived in his own isolated world. By adolescence, Chase began displaying traits of what psychologists later recognized as the McDonald Triad, early markers of violent behavior. He wet the bed far past the usual age, displayed cruelty toward animals, and started playing with fire. While other kids his age were experimenting with sports, dating, or hanging out with friends, Richard seemed stuck in a darker place. His social awkwardness made him a target for bullying, further isolating him from the world. As he entered his teenage years, another troubling pattern began to emerge. Richard developed severe hypochondria. He constantly complained that something was wrong with his body. He believed his heart would stop beating at any moment, or that his blood was turning to powder. At times, he even insisted that his stomach was on backwards. He was convinced his body was failing him, and doctors, confused by his bizarre complaints, found nothing physically wrong. But inside Richard's mind, the delusion grew. In high school, he began abusing drugs and alcohol. Marijuana, LSD, and heavy drinking only worsened his paranoia. By the time he reached his 20s, Richard Chase was spiraling into full-blown psychosis. He believed that someone was stealing his blood, that his veins were collapsing, and that he was slowly dying. Desperate for a solution, he turned to a horrifying idea. If he could not produce enough blood to keep himself alive, he would have to take it from others. In 1975, his behavior became so erratic that he was institutionalized. During his stay in a psychiatric hospital, staff and patients gave him the nickname Dracula. Richard was found capturing small animals, such as birds and rabbits, and drinking their blood. Once, staff caught him with blood smeared around his mouth. He openly admitted that he killed the animals because he believed drinking their blood could cure his condition. Doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, but eventually, after treatment and medication, he was released. This decision would prove disastrous. By the late 1970s, Chase was living alone in Sacramento in a rundown apartment. Neighbors described him as thin, pale, and strange. He rarely bathed, walked around disheveled, and smelled strongly of decay. Inside his apartment, the scene was even more disturbing. The floors were stained with blood, the refrigerator held the remains of small animals he had killed, and empty cartons of soda were mixed with containers full of organs. Richard Chase was practicing on animals, but his fantasies were growing darker. He was preparing for something far worse. On December 29, 1977, Richard Chase crossed the line from delusion to murder. His first known victim was Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old man who was helping his wife bring groceries inside their home. Without warning, Richard drove by and fired 2 shots from his handgun, striking Griffin and killing him instantly. It was a random killing, senseless and cold, and it set the tone for what was to come. Less than a month later, on January 23, 1978, Chase escalated. He broke into the home of Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old pregnant woman. Teresa was alone at home, and Richard attacked her with terrifying brutality. He shot her 3 times, killing her instantly, and then proceeded to mutilate her body. In his delusion, He believed her organs and blood could cure him. He cut her open, removed organs, and drank her blood. The scene he left behind was one of horror, shocking even experienced homicide detectives. But Richard Chase was not finished. Only 4 days later, on January 27, 1978, he committed his most infamous crime. He broke into the home of the Miroth family. Inside were 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth, her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David, and a family friend, Dan Meredith. Richard killed Dan first, shooting him as he entered the house. Then he turned on the others. Evelyn was brutally murdered, Jason was shot, and little David was taken from the scene. Richard mutilated Evelyn's body, committing acts of necrophilia and cannibalism before fleeing with the toddler. When police arrived, the house was drenched in blood. The brutality was unlike anything they had seen before. For days, a massive manhunt spread across Sacramento as investigators raced to find the man responsible. 2 days later, the mutilated body of 22-month-old David was found in a box, hidden behind a church. Richard had killed the child and drank his blood. The city was gripped with fear. Parents kept their children indoors, and people double-locked their doors at night. Newspapers called the killer the Vampire of Sacramento, and the name stuck. But despite the terror, Chase's reckless behavior eventually led to his downfall. A woman who had survived an encounter with him recognized his face from police sketches. She reported him, and investigators quickly moved in. On January 28, 1978, police surrounded his apartment. Inside, they found a scene straight from a nightmare. The walls and floors were stained with blood. Utensils, containers, and a refrigerator held organs and animal remains. And hidden in the apartment was evidence linking him to the murders. Richard Chase was arrested, ending his short but terrifying reign of terror. At his trial in 1979, his defense argued insanity. They pointed to his schizophrenia, his delusions, and his obsession with blood as proof that he was not in control of his actions. But the jury was not convinced. The details of his crimes were too brutal, too deliberate. He was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death in the gas chamber. But Richard never made it to execution. On December 26, 1980, less than 2 years after his trial, he was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. He had stockpiled his prescribed medication, taking a fatal overdose. The Vampire of Sacramento had taken his own life. The story of Richard Trenton Chase is one of madness unleashed. Unlike killers who hide behind charm or carefully plot their crimes, Chase was a man consumed by delusion and driven by insanity. His life, from troubled childhood to institutionalization to horrific murder spree, reveals the terrifying reality of untreated mental illness mixed with violent obsession. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about one of the most disturbing crime couples in modern history. A story that reveals how 2 seemingly ordinary people could hide the darkest of secrets behind the closed doors of their home. Where neighbors thought they were simply raising children, but in reality, they were torturing, killing, and burying bodies beneath the very floorboards they walked on. This is the terrifying story of Fred and Rose West, the monsters of Cromwell Street. Fred West was born in September of 1941 in the small village of Muchmarkle in rural Herefordshire, England. At first glance, his early life appeared unremarkable. The son of a farmer, surrounded by animals, chores, and the quietness of the countryside. But behind this appearance lay a family environment that was toxic and unsettling. His father was strict and dominating, often blurring the boundaries of discipline, while his mother, cold and harsh, offered little comfort. In this atmosphere, Fred grew up without tenderness, without stability, and with a distorted sense of relationships and control. From an early age, Fred struggled in school. Teachers described him as slow to learn, easily distracted, and prone to angry outbursts. By the time he was 15, he abandoned education entirely and began working full-time on the farm. Yet work did not give him structure or discipline. Instead, Fred grew restless, often chasing young girls and gaining a reputation for being crude and forceful in his advances. The seeds of his later violence were already being sown. When Fred was 17, his life changed dramatically. In 1958, while riding his motorcycle, he crashed violently, suffering a fractured skull, a broken arm, and a severe head injury that left him in a coma for a week. Doctors managed to save his life, but when he woke, he was not the same. Friends and family noticed a change in his personality. He became impulsive, prone to violent outbursts, and even more reckless than before. Brain damage, particularly in the frontal lobe, can destroy a person's ability to control urges, and in Fred's case, it seemed to unlock his darkest instincts. Only 2 years later, he suffered yet another serious head injury when he fell from a fire escape. The combination of repeated trauma further eroded his ability to manage his impulses. His temper grew shorter, his desires more disturbing, and his actions more erratic. Fred West was becoming a danger to everyone around him. In 1962, Fred married Catherine Costello, a Scottish woman known as Rena. She already had a daughter from a previous relationship, and Fred accepted her into the household. At first, it looked like Fred might finally settle into a domestic life, but the violence and control that simmered beneath the surface quickly revealed itself. He was abusive toward Rena, controlling every aspect of her life, and soon as I wandered to much younger women, including teenage girls. His household was not a place of love, but of fear. Their relationship broke down quickly. Fred's violent outbursts and constant cheating drove Rena away. She tried to escape with the children, but Fred's possessiveness was overwhelming. He had already begun to believe that women were objects he could dominate, and that belief would shape the rest of his life. It was in 1969 that Fred's path collided with Rosemary Letts, a 15-year-old girl from a troubled family of her own. Rose had grown up in a deeply dysfunctional home, with a father who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and controlled her every move. She was isolated, emotionally scarred, and searching for stability. When she met Fred, she was drawn to him. He was older, confident, and he showered her with attention. What she didn't realize was that she was walking into the orbit of a predator. By the time Rose turned 16, she was living with Fred, helping care for his children from previous relationships. But Fred was not just a partner. He was also a teacher, molding her into the same pattern of cruelty and control that defined his own life. Very soon, Rose's darker side began to emerge. She was not just a passive victim of Fred's abuse. She became an active participant, joining him in the acts of violence, sexual abuse, and eventually murder. Together, Fred and Rose created a household of horrors. On the surface, their home at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester looked like any other working-class house. Neighbors heard children playing in the yard, saw Fred working odd jobs, and Rose cooking meals. But beneath the floorboards and in the garden, terrible secrets were buried. The Wests were luring young women into their home, often under the pretense of offering them a place to stay, before subjecting them to unspeakable abuse, torture, and finally killing them. Their own children lived inside this nightmare, witnessing violence and experiencing abuse themselves. One of their earliest known victims was Anna McFall, a young nanny who lived with Fred and cared for his children. She became pregnant with his child, but in 1967 she disappeared. Her remains were later found dismembered, buried in a field near Muchmarkle. This was just the beginning. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, Fred and Rose continued their reign of terror. Victims included lodgers, runaway teenagers, and even their own family members. In 1971, Fred's own daughter, Charmaine, from his marriage to Rena, vanished. She had been left in Rose's care, and Rose killed her in a fit of rage. Fred later buried her body under the kitchen floor. Rena herself also disappeared soon after, later found dismembered. Their house on Cromwell Street became known as the House of Horrors. Victims were lured inside, where they were tied up, subjected to days of torture, sexual assault, and eventually strangled or killed. Fred had a chilling method of disposing of the bodies. He dismembered them carefully, sometimes even removing bones as keepsakes, before burying the remains in shallow graves beneath the cellar or the garden. To the outside world, Fred was simply doing renovations on his home, but in reality, he was digging graves. By the time their crimes were uncovered in the 1990s, the West were responsible for at least 12 confirmed murders, though investigators believe the number could be higher. The names of the victims included young women like Lucy Partington, Juanita Mott, and Shirley Hubbard, all of whom vanished without a trace until their remains were found beneath the West home. Their reign of terror only ended when one of their daughters finally spoke out, reporting the years of abuse to the police. In 1994, police entered 25 Cromwell Street and began excavating the floors and gardens. What they found shocked the world. Bones, remains, and evidence of dismemberment were scattered throughout the property. It became clear that the Wests had used their home as a hunting ground, a torture chamber, and a burial site. Fred West was arrested, and while awaiting trial in 1995, he took his own life in prison, hanging himself in his cell. Rose West, however, went to trial. She was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of release. She remains in prison to this day, one of the most infamous female serial killers in Britain. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who believed that killing was not an act of evil, but an act of protection, a twisted duty he thought was saving California from destruction. In his mind, the earth demanded blood to remain calm, and he saw himself as the chosen one to provide it. This is the story of Herbert Mullen, the man who became known as the Earthquake Killer. His path from an ordinary childhood in small-town California to a spree of brutal murders is one of the strangest and most disturbing stories in American true crime. Herbert Mullen was born on April 18, 1947, in Salinas, California. His father was a veteran of World War II, a strict man who tried to raise his son with discipline and structure. His mother was more reserved, more religious, and worried constantly about her sensitive boy. Mullen had a seemingly normal childhood, and by all outward appearances, there were no obvious signs that he would grow into someone who would terrify his community. In fact, he was popular in high school. He had friends, played sports, and was even voted most likely to succeed. Teachers considered him intelligent and thoughtful, though a little shy. His family and friends thought he had a bright future, but there were cracks beneath the surface. Mullen was extremely sensitive to criticism. He often brooded when teased or corrected. He also became obsessed with the idea of death at a young age. When one of his close friends was killed in a car accident shortly after high school, Mullen took it harder than anyone else. He built a shrine to his dead friend in his room, covering his walls with pictures and memories. What others saw as a tragic accident, Mullen interpreted as a sign, a kind of spiritual message that death was always close. After graduating, Mullen briefly tried to pursue higher education, enrolling in community college, but his mental health began to collapse. By the late 1960s, when he was in his early 20s, he was hearing voices and experiencing paranoid delusions. Doctors would later diagnose him with paranoid schizophrenia, but at the time, the understanding of mental illness was limited. His family noticed his erratic behavior, but did not know how to help. He experimented with drugs like LSD, which only worsened his condition. He began rambling about telepathy, about people communicating with him through thoughts, and about needing to prepare for disasters. By 1971, Mullen was convinced that California was on the brink of destruction. In his mind, massive earthquakes were coming, and the only way to prevent them was through blood sacrifices. He believed that every time he killed someone, the earth would be satisfied and disaster would be averted. This delusion would define the rest of his life. His first murder came in October 1972. He picked up a homeless man who was hitchhiking. Mullen later said that the man gave him a telepathic message granting permission to kill him. On the side of the road, Mullen beat the man to death, leaving his body discarded as if it were nothing more than a ritual offering. To Mullen, this was not murder, it was duty. He felt relief afterward, as though he had just done what the voices demanded. Once the dam had broken, the killings came faster. In November 1972, he killed Mary Guilfoyle, a young college student. He picked her up while she was hitchhiking to school, and during the drive, he stabbed her to death. Afterward, he dismembered her body and scattered the remains in the forest. To him, Mary was another sacrifice, another life that would prevent the earth from splitting apart. In December of that same year, he turned his violence towards someone close to him. He killed a Catholic priest named Father Henri Tomé in a confessional booth. The priest had been offering Mullen spiritual guidance, but in his delusional state, Mullen believed he had been commanded to kill him. The murder was brutal, carried out in a sacred space, shocking the community and further cementing his belief that he was carrying out necessary sacrifices. The killings escalated. In January 1973, Mullen murdered his family's old friend, a man named Jim Johnera, and Jim's wife. Jim had once helped Mullen's father find work, but this connection meant nothing in the grip of delusion. Mullen claimed that Jim had communicated telepathically with him, giving permission to be sacrificed. He shot them both dead in their own home, leaving behind another senseless tragedy. In February 1973, Mullen's spree reached its peak. He targeted strangers in the most random ways imaginable. He murdered 4 teenagers who were camping in the woods, shooting them without hesitation. He killed an elderly man working in his yard, bludgeoning him to death simply because the opportunity presented itself. He even killed a hitchhiker on a whim. In just a matter of weeks, the body count piled up, and Northern California was gripped with fear. What made the fear even greater was that Mullen was not the only killer operating in the area at the time. Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, was also active in Santa Cruz, murdering young women. The community was horrified, unable to comprehend that 2 different killers were stalking the same region at the same time. People locked their doors, stopped hitchhiking, and lived in constant paranoia. Mullen's spree finally came to an end on February 13th, 1973. He killed a man named Fred Perez, shooting him in the driveway of his home in broad daylight. This time, there were witnesses. Neighbors saw the murder and immediately called police. Officers arrived quickly and arrested Mullen without resistance. His killing spree had ended after 13 victims. When questioned, Mullen explained his actions with a chilling sense of calm. He told investigators that the earth required sacrifices to prevent earthquakes. He said he had been chosen, that each victim was necessary, and that he had been following commands he received telepathically. To him, it all made perfect sense. To the rest of the world, it was madness. At his trial, the question was not whether Mullen had killed. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was whether he was sane enough to be held responsible. The defense argued that his schizophrenia made him incapable of understanding his actions. The prosecution argued that despite his delusions, he still knew murder was wrong. In the end, the jury convicted him of 10 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he would spend the rest of his days. Herbert Mullen's story is a haunting one because it blurs the line between insanity and responsibility. He was deeply mentally ill, plagued by voices and visions he could not escape. But he also carried out his murders with planning, choosing his victims and carrying out his rituals as though fulfilling a mission. For the people of California, his crimes left a scar, not only because of the lives lost, but because of the sheer strangeness of his beliefs. He remains a reminder that violence can come not only from hatred or greed, but from delusion, from a mind convinced that killing is a necessity. His victims were random, chosen not for who they were, but for what he believed they represented. Each life taken was, in his eyes, a sacrifice to the earth. For the rest of us, it was a tragedy, a senseless loss at the hands of a man who thought murder was salvation. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a case that shook the United States and revealed how far a criminal could go while hiding behind charm and intelligence. This is the story of Rodney Alcala, a man who became known as the dating game killer, a predator who fooled television producers, game show audiences, and even law enforcement, while secretly carrying out a series of brutal murders that spanned decades. Rodney James Alcala was born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1943. His childhood was unsettled. His father abandoned the family when Rodney was still young, and his mother moved the children to Los Angeles. From early on, Alcala showed signs of intelligence and charisma. He joined the army in 1961, but his career in the military ended abruptly when he suffered what was described as a nervous breakdown. Army psychiatrists diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, a condition often linked with a lack of empathy and remorse. After being discharged, Alcala enrolled in art school in New York City, where he studied film and photography. To the outside world, he was a student chasing his dreams. In reality, he was beginning to live a double life. In 1968, Alcala committed his first known crime. An 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro was walking to school in Los Angeles when Alcala lured her into his apartment. Once inside, he brutally assaulted her. A passerby who saw Tali get into Alcala's car reported it to police, and officers arrived at his apartment just in time to save the child's life. But Alcala had already fled. By the time authorities forced their way inside, they found Tali bleeding and barely alive, but Alcala was gone. He vanished, slipping out of the city before anyone could catch him. He resurfaced in New York under a false name. There, he enrolled at NYU and studied under the famous film director Roman Polanski. Alcala posed as an aspiring photographer, often approaching women and asking if he could take their pictures. Many agreed, believing him to be a harmless student. What they didn't know was that Alcala was amassing a collection of photographs. Thousands of images of women, men, and children, some innocent, some deeply unsettling. Later, police would uncover these photos and suspect that many of the women had never been seen again. In 1971, Alcala was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. He was eventually arrested after 2 children recognized him from a wanted poster. Extradited back to California, he was convicted of assaulting Tali Shapiro. But because of changes in laws and a plea bargain, he served only a few years before being released. The freedom gave him an open path to continue killing. During the 1970s, young women began disappearing in California. Some were last seen with a man who introduced himself as a photographer. Their bodies were later found strangled, beaten, or dumped in remote areas. Alcala's pattern was chilling. He lured women by offering modeling opportunities, took their pictures, and then attacked. His charm and ability to appear trustworthy helped him find victims easily. In 1978, Alcala made his most public appearance. He became a contestant on the television show The Dating Game. With his long hair, wide smile, and confident banter, he fit the mold of the eligible bachelor the show liked to feature. On stage, he joked with the female contestant and won the game, beating out the other men. But behind the scenes, the woman who was supposed to go on a date with him found him unsettling. She refused to meet him afterward, saying he gave her a strange and creepy feeling. At the time, no one knew that the smiling bachelor on national television was in fact a serial killer. Over the next few years, Alcala's crimes escalated. He is confirmed to have killed at least 7 women, but investigators believe the true number could be far higher, possibly dozens. His victims included 18-year-old Jill Barkham, 27-year-old Georgia Wixted, 32-year-old Charlotte Lamb, 21-year-old Jill Parento, and 12-year-old Robin Samso, a child who disappeared in 1979 while riding her bicycle in Huntington Beach, California. Robin's disappearance finally brought Alcala down. When Robin failed to return home, her family called police, who launched a frantic search. Her remains were discovered 12 days later in the foothills near Pasadena. Witnesses told investigators that they had seen a strange man taking photographs of Robin shortly before she vanished. A composite sketch was created, and it closely resembled Rodney Alcala. Police raided his storage locker, where they found hundreds of photographs of women and children, along with jewelry and items belonging to some of the victims. Alcala was arrested and charged with Robin Samso's murder. His first trial in 1980 ended with a conviction and a death sentence, but appeals courts overturned the ruling because of legal technicalities. He was retried, convicted again, and sentenced to death once more, only for that verdict to also be overturned. It wasn't until 2010, after decades of delays, that Alcala was definitively convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death for the third and final time. During his 2010 trial, prosecutors presented not only the evidence from Robin's case, but also the murders of 4 other women. They showed jurors the disturbing photos Alcala had taken, many of which depicted women in vulnerable or suggestive poses. Some of those photographed were never identified, leading to the belief that Alcala had many more victims. The sheer volume of photographs, over 1,000 images, left investigators with haunting questions. How many of these women had survived encounters with him? How many never made it home? Alcala sat in court, older and heavier, but still with the same unsettling smirk. When given the chance to speak, he rambled, offering bizarre statements and even playing a portion of the song Alice's Restaurant as part of his defense, as though mocking the proceedings. The jury was not swayed. They found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Despite the sentence, Alcala never made it to the execution chamber. He spent his final years on death row in California's San Quentin prison. On July 24, 2021, he died of natural causes at the age of 77. For the families of his victims, his death brought an end to decades of trials and appeals, but it did not erase the pain or answer the lingering questions about how many lives he truly destroyed. Rodney Alcala's story is remembered not only for the brutality of his crimes, but also for the eerie contrast between his public image and his private reality. To television audiences, he was a smiling contestant. To his neighbors, he was a harmless photographer. But to his victims, he was a predator who turned charm into a weapon. His ability to hide in plain sight, to use trust as bait, and to leave behind so many unanswered questions makes him one of the most chilling killers in American history. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about one of the most chilling predators Europe ever produced. A quiet, unremarkable man who walked among his neighbors for decades, while secretly committing crimes so brutal they barely sound human. This is the story of Joachim Kroll, the Ruhr cannibal of Germany, a murderer who left behind a trail of blood, horror, and unspeakable secrets hidden in the most ordinary of places. Joachim Kroll was born in 1933 in Hindenburg, Germany, into a family torn apart by poverty and the chaos of war. His father was a soldier in the German army, leaving his mother and siblings to scrape by during the worst years of deprivation. Kroll grew up isolated, slow to learn, and was often bullied for his awkwardness. Teachers described him as a boy who struggled with the simplest lessons, and other children saw him as weak and strange. That combination, humiliation, neglect, and loneliness, began shaping a darkness inside him that would one day consume lives. By the late 1940s, his family relocated to the industrial Ruhr area of West Germany, a place of factories, coal, and working-class neighborhoods. Outwardly, Kroll blended into this world of tired workers and small apartments. He found odd jobs as a factory hand and a laborer. People who knew him said he was quiet, simple, even timid. No one suspected that beneath that meek surface was a man who would transform the Ruhr Valley into his personal hunting ground. His crimes began in 1955. That year, a 19-year-old girl named Irmgard Strell was brutally murdered. She had been strangled and violated, her body mutilated in ways too horrifying to describe in detail. At the time, police had no leads. West Germany was still recovering from the devastation of war, and resources were stretched thin. The case faded into the background, another unsolved tragedy in a country with too many scars. But for Kroll, it was only the beginning. Over the years, he refined his methods. He often stalked lonely roads, parks, and riverbanks, looking for young women or children. He strangled them, assaulted their bodies, and then mutilated them afterward. His killings were spread across towns in the Ruhr region, Duisburg, Essen, Marl, Wuppertal, leaving police chasing shadows. Each crime seemed isolated, with no obvious connection. Kroll's unassuming lifestyle gave him the perfect cover. He was the quiet man in a shabby apartment. No family, no friends, no enemies. As the years turned into decades, the body count grew. Investigators believe he killed at least 13 people, possibly many more. But what made Kroll stand out from other killers wasn't just his violence. It was his horrifying compulsion after the murders. He didn't simply kill, he cannibalized. He admitted to cutting pieces of flesh from some victims and cooking them in stews or frying them like cheap cuts of meat. He later told police that eating human flesh was a way to save money on groceries. The banality of his explanation made his crimes even more grotesque. By the 1960s, fear was spreading in the Ruhr Valley. Parents warned children not to walk home alone, women avoided traveling at night, and police departments were overwhelmed by the pressure to find whoever was behind these sporadic but shocking crimes. Yet Kroll remained invisible, the quiet neighbor no one noticed. He moved from apartment to apartment, taking low-wage jobs and staying out of trouble. His simple, unthreatening appearance fooled everyone. Then, in July 1976, everything collapsed. A young girl named Marion Ketter disappeared while playing outside. Panic gripped her neighborhood, and police launched a desperate search. They canvassed the area, knocking on doors, questioning residents. That's when they knocked on Joachim Kroll's apartment. What they found inside stunned even veteran officers. In his tiny kitchen, a pot was simmering on the stove. Floating inside, it were pieces of meat and vegetables, and what investigators quickly realized were human remains. In his refrigerator and freezer, they found more flesh wrapped and stored. The bathroom pipes were clogged with skin and organs he had tried to flush. And in his confession, Kroll casually admitted to killing Marion, dismembering her, and saving her body for food. The trial that followed revealed the full scale of his atrocities. He calmly described his murders, sometimes in chilling detail, as though he were talking about routine chores. The court heard how he strangled, mutilated, and cannibalized his victims across a span of more than 20 years. Doctors testified about his low intelligence. His IQ was barely above that of a child, yet that simplicity had helped him avoid suspicion for so long. In 1982, Joachim Kroll was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991, still remembered as one of the most disturbing killers in German history. His story remains a terrifying reminder that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people can harbor the darkest secrets imaginable. This was not a monster hiding in the shadows. This was a man living in plain sight, cooking his meals, walking among neighbors, nodding politely in stairwells, while behind closed doors, committing crimes that left scars on families and nightmares on an entire nation. Next story. I am going to tell you a story about a man who seemed ordinary, almost invisible in the crowded streets of Tokyo, yet harbored a darkness so consuming it would terrify an entire nation. He lived quietly, blending into the rhythm of daily life. Yet in the shadows, he carried out crimes so cruel, so calculated, and so disturbing that parents locked their doors in fear. Children were watched obsessively, and communities trembled. This is the story of Tsutomu Miyazaki, known as the Otaku Killer, a man whose life of isolation, obsession, and horror would leave an indelible mark on Japanese history. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born on August 22, 1962, in the suburbs of Tokyo. From the start, his life was marked by isolation. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised primarily by his mother, who doted on him to an unusual degree. Her overprotection and intense attention shielded him from the outside world, but it also created a sense of detachment. He struggled to interact with peers, often retreating into his own world, a world filled with horror stories, dark fantasies, and an obsession with death. While other children played outside, Miyazaki spent hours alone in his room, immersed in books, magazines, anime, and films that fed his growing fascination with the macabre. During his teenage years, his social isolation deepened. He dropped out of school, unable to connect with classmates, and spent most of his time wandering the streets or immersing himself in his fantasies. It was during this period that his obsessions with young girls and death began to coalesce into something dangerous. He started following children, learning their routines, memorizing their homes, and imagining what he might do to them. These were not random thoughts. They were deliberate, rehearsed, and methodical. The boundary between fantasy and reality in his mind began to blur. By the late 1980s, Miyazaki's fantasies had turned into action. His first known murder occurred in 1988 when he abducted a young girl. He lured her quietly, struck swiftly, and then returned home with the cold precision of someone who had rehearsed every step. He assaulted her, committed acts of extreme cruelty, and ultimately ended her life. This first act of violence set the pattern for the crimes that would follow. Careful observation, strategic planning, and a chilling detachment from the horror he inflicted. Miyazaki's attacks were not only violent, but also psychologically disturbing. He sometimes left letters for the families of his victims, taunting them, giving them hints, revealing intimate knowledge of their lives. In some cases, he sent photographs or videotapes documenting his acts for himself. His need to control the narrative extended beyond the act of murder itself. He wanted to manipulate the grief and fear of those left behind. He was meticulous, calculating, and in many ways theatrical, using his crimes to create a private world of power and dominance. As his spree continued, he targeted multiple young girls in suburban Tokyo and surrounding regions. Each abduction followed a similar pattern. He observed, stalked, and selected his victims carefully, often spending hours or even days planning his approach. He exploited trust and innocence, using the guise of friendliness, familiarity, or simple proximity to lure children away from safety. Once he had them, he committed unspeakable acts of assault and murder, leaving the bodies in locations that delayed discovery or confounded investigators. The scale and consistency of Miyazaki's crimes soon attracted the attention of Japanese authorities. Parents were terrified, communities were on high alert, and investigators were faced with the terrifying realization that the perpetrator was intelligent, methodical, and utterly devoid of empathy. Witnesses described seeing him near the scenes of abductions, sometimes appearing polite or unassuming, other times observing from a distance with a quiet intensity that suggested careful calculation. In 1989, the authorities finally connected the murders and narrowed in on Miyazaki. Surveillance, forensic evidence, and careful interviews with witnesses led to his capture. When police entered his home, they discovered a scene that confirmed their worst suspicions. Items documenting his obsession with children and death, photographs, journals, and tapes that revealed the depth of his planning and the extent of his depravity. He did not resist arrest, and during questioning, he revealed the chilling calm with which he had committed his acts, showing no remorse or empathy. The trial of Tsutomu Miyazaki was intense, disturbing, and widely covered by the media. Psychologists examined him and concluded that he suffered from severe personality disorders, sexual sadism, and psychopathy. He attempted to manipulate the courtroom, demonstrating the same control and detachment that he had used during his crimes. His lack of remorse, combined with the meticulous planning of his murders, painted a picture of a man who had constructed a private world where he could act with absolute dominance, and where morality and empathy had no place. Miyazaki was ultimately convicted of multiple murders, abductions, and assaults. He was sentenced to death, and the sentence was carried out in 2008. Yet even after his death, his story continues to haunt Japan. It serves as a terrifying reminder of the dangers of isolation, obsession, and the extremes of the human mind. His name remains etched in criminal history, and parents and psychologists alike study the case to understand how a seemingly ordinary individual can commit acts of extreme cruelty while living in plain sight. The life of Tsutomu Miyazaki is a story of darkness, meticulous violence, and psychological obsession. He lived quietly, moving unnoticed through society, yet he left an enduring trail of fear, grief, and horror. His crimes were methodical and calculated, demonstrating a mind detached from humanity and a chilling capacity for control and cruelty. Communities remember the terror he inspired. Parents remember watching over their children more closely than ever. And his story remains a cautionary tale about how evil can hide in the most ordinary of places, slowly, quietly, and devastatingly. Even decades later, Miyazaki's name continues to evoke fear. The otaku killer's life shows how obsession and isolation can create a monster, how fantasy can transform into action, and how a man who seemed invisible could strike with precision and leave permanent scars on countless families. His story endures not only as a record of horror, but also as a slow, hypnotic lesson in the depths of human darkness, a reminder that terror can lurk behind the most ordinary faces, and that sometimes the quietest people are capable of the most profound cruelty. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who wandered across countries as if the world belonged to him alone, a man who used trains, small towns, and the shadows of society to hide the darkness in his soul. He was called the Railroad Killer, a name whispered in fear along the tracks that he traveled, leaving behind a trail of death and confusion, a man whose life was both a journey and a reign of terror. This is the story of Angel Maturino Resendez, whose life was defined by violence, deception, and the restless wanderings that allowed him to strike fear into two nations. Angel Maturino Resendez was born on August 1st, 1959, in Irapuato, Guanajuato, a city in central Mexico. From the beginning, his life was difficult. Poverty surrounded him, and he learned early that survival often meant bending the rules, lying, and taking advantage of any situation. His family was unstable, and Angel quickly realized that trust was fragile, that people could not always be relied upon, and that the world was harsh and unforgiving. As a child, he became skilled at observing, blending in, and manipulating situations to his benefit. He left school early and began drifting, working small jobs one day and disappearing the next. By his teenage years, Angel had already developed the instincts that would define his criminal life. He learned how to travel unnoticed, how to take what he needed, and how to navigate towns and cities without drawing attention. He moved across Mexico, riding trains illegally, hopping fences, and sleeping wherever he could find shelter. By 18, he had committed petty thefts, fraud, and minor assaults, and his reputation in local police reports began to grow. But these early crimes were only the surface of what he would become. In the early 1980s, Resendez crossed into the United States, a young man with experience in survival, disguise, and deception. He worked odd jobs, moving from town to town, always on the move, always following the tracks of trains that connected cities and states. The railroads were more than just transportation to him. They were a network of freedom, allowing him to live untethered, to appear in one place and vanish into another in hours. And along these tracks, he began killing. His attacks were methodical. He would select victims who were vulnerable, often people living near train tracks or traveling along them. Some were hitchhikers, others were families living in isolated areas. Angel used knives, firearms, and blunt objects, striking with precision, leaving his victims disoriented, injured, or dead. He sometimes burned homes, stole possessions, or left bodies in ways that confused investigators. The randomness of his locations and the mobility provided by the railroads made it almost impossible for local law enforcement to connect the crimes at first. During the mid-1980s, Resendez became bolder. He murdered in small towns across Texas, Louisiana, and other southern states. His victims were not chosen at random in the sense of chaos. They were often selected for perceived weakness or opportunity. He moved quickly, striking at night, hiding during the day, blending into communities as a harmless transient. He slept in abandoned houses, rode in freight cars, and kept a low profile, yet he left behind a trail of terror. Police began to notice the similarities in the crimes. Victims killed near railways, similar methods of attack, signs of premeditation, and the way the killer disappeared as quickly as he arrived. The early 1990s saw a continuation of his spree. Angel became almost a ghost, traveling thousands of miles, often leaving one state only to appear hundreds of miles away with another murder. Some victims survived, giving investigators brief glimpses of a man who was calm, polite, even charming when confronted. But once alone, he transformed into a predator. His meticulous planning ensured that he could evade capture repeatedly. Fingerprints, footprints, and forensic evidence were scarce, and the interstate nature of his crimes meant that law enforcement agencies struggled to communicate and track him. Resendez's killings were not only numerous but also psychologically chilling. He seemed to relish the mobility, the ability to strike anywhere, and the sense of control over life and death. Some survivors reported that he would speak softly, almost conversationally, before attacking. Others remembered his strange ability to disappear into a crowd or vanish into the darkness of a train yard. He was patient, waiting for hours or days for the right opportunity. He traveled light, never staying in one place long enough for suspicion to grow. Communities were left bewildered, with the knowledge that a killer had passed through and often no concrete evidence of who had committed the act. It was his increasing boldness that led to mistakes and eventually his capture. Law enforcement began coordinating across states, analyzing similarities, witness statements, and locations near railroad tracks. A combination of surveillance, informants, and forensic breakthroughs finally allowed them to track him down. In 1999, Angel Maturino Resendez was arrested. He did not resist violently at first, but his capture ended years of nomadic terror. During interrogations, he confessed to multiple murders, describing in chilling detail how he selected victims, traveled unnoticed, and maintained his freedom across borders. His confessions revealed a man who saw murder not as a crime, but as an extension of the life he had chosen, a dark and mobile existence where no one could catch him. Angel was sentenced to death in the United States. His execution came in 2006, ending a life of continuous motion and murder. Even in death, the legend of the railroad killer endures. Investigators and historians still discuss the full extent of his crimes, estimating that he may have killed dozens, possibly over 100 people, with some victims never identified. Communities along railways remember the fear he brought, and his story remains a chilling example of a killer who used the very mobility and infrastructure of modern life to evade justice and leave terror in his wake. Angel Maturino Resendez's story is one that hypnotizes and horrifies, a story of relentless movement, cunning, and unbridled violence. He drifted across borders, struck without warning, and vanished into the night, leaving only the echo of his crimes behind. It is a story that continues to haunt, a story of how one man turned trains, towns, and anonymity into a network for murder, and how he became a ghost of fear and death on tracks that spanned two nations. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who lived two completely different lives. To strangers, he looked like a smooth-talking charmer with long hair, a wide grin, and a strange sense of humor. He even walked on national television in the 1970s, standing under bright studio lights, flirting with a woman on a game show, as if he were just another bachelor looking for love. But behind that smile was a predator who hunted with patience and cruelty, a man who carried a camera as a disguise, and whose true hobby was one of the darkest the world has ever known. This is the story of Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer, a man whose crimes stretched across decades, whose number of victims is still unknown, and whose mask of charm allowed him to kill again and again. Rodney James Alcala was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. His family life was unstable from the beginning. His father abandoned the family when Rodney was just a child, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings alone. They later moved to Los Angeles, where Rodney grew up in a strict household, but showed signs early on that something in him was different. He was intelligent, gifted in art and music, but he also developed a sense of superiority and a lack of empathy for others. At 17, he joined the U.S. Army and served as a clerk. But military life did not last long. In 1964, after suffering what was described as a nervous breakdown, he was diagnosed with a personality disorder and discharged. Returning to civilian life, Alcala began crafting the image of a young man who was cultured, charming, and creative. He studied film under Roman Polanski in New York, surrounded himself with art and photography, and appeared to be someone going places. But beneath that surface, his urges were spiraling. In 1968, those urges erupted. He lured an 8-year-old girl into his Hollywood apartment and attacked her. She survived thanks to a witness who saw the assault and called police, but Alcala managed to escape. He fled to New York, where he reinvented himself under a new name. There, he enrolled at New York University, building yet another mask for himself. But the violence never stopped. In 1971, he was put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for another brutal attack. Still, he managed to keep moving, slipping through cracks in the system. By the mid-1970s, Alcala developed a method that would define his crimes. He posed as a photographer, carrying a camera, sometimes even a professional-looking portfolio. He would approach young women, teenagers, and even children in parks, beaches, and busy city streets. He promised free photo sessions, a chance to be in his portfolio, or even the suggestion of a modeling opportunity. Many people trusted him. Some followed him into secluded places. They thought they were posing for pictures. Instead, they were being lured to their deaths. Alcala's attacks were drawn out and sadistic. He often strangled his victims until they lost consciousness, then revived them, only to strangle them again. He prolonged the suffering, savoring the control he had over life and death. Victims were beaten, assaulted, and left mutilated. Later, investigators would describe him as a killer who enjoyed turning the act of murder into a performance, one he controlled from beginning to end, as if it were part of his private theater. Then came 1978, the year that made his case infamous. Alcala walked onto the stage of a television show called The Dating Game, dressed in a brown shirt, smiling broadly, with long hair framing his face. He was introduced as a successful bachelor. The host asked playful questions, the studio audience laughed, and Alcala delivered cheeky answers with perfect confidence. He even won. The female contestant, Cheryl Bradshaw, picked him as her date over 2 other bachelors. But after the show ended, she refused to go out with him, telling producers that he gave her a creepy, unsettling feeling. She may have escaped her own death with that instinct, because while Alcala was on that stage charming the crowd, he was already an active serial killer. Throughout the late 1970s, his crimes escalated. He murdered women in California and New York, leaving behind bodies that showed both cruelty and calculation. He traveled freely, carrying his camera, approaching strangers, and adding photographs to his growing private collection. When police finally searched his belongings years later, they found hundreds of pictures of unidentified women and children, some of whom have never been traced. The haunting question remains whether these were all potential victims, or whether many of them were already dead. It was the murder of 12-year-old Robin Samsoe in 1979 that finally began to unravel his facade. Robin disappeared while riding her bike to ballet class. Friends reported seeing her speaking to a strange man with a camera. Witnesses later identified Alcala as that man. When police searched his home, they found earrings belonging to Robin among his belongings. That discovery was enough to link him to her killing, and Alcala was arrested. But the legal battle dragged on for decades. His first conviction was overturned. Appeals delayed justice. At one point, he even acted as his own lawyer, standing in court questioning witnesses and cross-examining detectives, dragging out the process with a bizarre display of arrogance. Eventually, after years of trials, appeals, and new investigations, Alcala was convicted of multiple murders. He was sentenced to death in California. Even behind bars, the mystery of Rodney Alcala never faded. Police released some of his photographs to the public, hoping to identify women and children in the images. Some were identified as alive and safe. Others were confirmed as victims. Many remain unknown. To this day, the true number of lives Alcala destroyed has never been established. Rodney Alcala died in 2021 while awaiting execution. He took his secrets with him, leaving behind hundreds of photographs, countless grieving families, and the chilling reminder that a man can hide among us, smiling for the cameras, even entertaining a television audience, while secretly living a life of horror. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who turned his charm into a weapon, a man who could walk into a room, smile, and instantly disarm people with his friendliness while secretly plotting their deaths. He was handsome, intelligent, and outwardly successful. Yet beneath the surface, he was hiding a compulsion to kill that would make him one of the most infamous murderers in history. This is the story of Ted Bundy, a man whose name has become synonymous with calculated evil. Ted Bundy was born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, under circumstances that would shape the confusion of his identity. Raised believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister, Bundy grew up feeling deceived, carrying anger that never fully left him. He moved with his mother to Washington State, where he became a quiet, intelligent student. On the surface, he was shy, reserved, and awkward, but behind his polite smile, he nursed insecurities and a deep desire for control. As Bundy entered adulthood, he developed the outward appearance of a successful young man. He attended university, studied law, and became active in politics, even volunteering on campaigns. To friends and colleagues, he was ambitious and charismatic. Women found him attractive, and men admired his charm. Yet beneath this carefully crafted image, Bundy was already struggling with violent urges. He stalked women in secret, developing fantasies of domination and murder that he would soon act upon. Bundy's killing spree began in the early 1970s in Washington and Oregon. His method was carefully calculated. He often pretended to be injured, wearing a fake cast or using crutches to lure women into helping him. Once he had their trust, he would strike, kidnapping them, assaulting them, and killing them, often with brutal violence. He carefully chose his victims: young, attractive women with similar features, usually long hair parted down the middle. The pattern became unmistakable, yet Bundy remained invisible to investigators for years. As the number of missing women grew, panic spread across college campuses and communities. Bundy, meanwhile, continued to live a double life. He dated, maintained friendships, and even held jobs, all while abducting and murdering women. He would sometimes return to crime scenes, a chilling sign of his compulsion to relive the violence. Bundy thrived on deception, blending into society so effectively that even when police released composite sketches, people who knew him refused to believe he could be the killer. Bundy's crimes escalated in boldness. He traveled across state lines, leaving victims in Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, complicating investigations and confusing police. He even managed to evade capture multiple times, slipping through the cracks of law enforcement's coordination. When he was finally arrested in 1975, it was for a traffic violation that led to the discovery of burglary tools and suspicious items in his car. Despite growing suspicion, Bundy denied everything with confidence, his charm and intelligence helping him avoid conviction for years. In 1977, Bundy managed to escape custody not once but twice. First, he leapt from a courthouse window during a recess, vanishing into the mountains before being recaptured. Months later, he escaped again, slipping through the ceiling of his cell and walking out of the jail as if he were invisible. His second escape led to his most notorious crimes. Bundy traveled to Florida, where he committed one of the most brutal attacks of his spree. In January 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University and attacked multiple women in their sleep, killing 2 and severely injuring others. Weeks later, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, a crime that horrified the nation. His luck finally ran out when he was pulled over by police in Florida and gave a false name. A fingerprint check revealed his true identity, and this time, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The trial of Ted Bundy became a media sensation. He chose to represent himself in court, using his charm to manipulate the jury and the press. But the details of his crimes were too horrific to ignore. In 1979, he was convicted of the sorority murders and later of Kimberly Leach's murder, receiving multiple death sentences. Bundy remained on death row for nearly a decade. During that time, he gave interviews, sometimes denying his guilt, sometimes hinting at the scale of his crimes. He eventually confessed to killing over 30 women. though experts believe the true number may be higher. He described his killings with chilling detachment, as if recounting routine events rather than lives stolen. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Crowds gathered outside, cheering as the news spread, a reflection of the fear and anger his crimes had left behind. His death marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, yet his name continues to symbolize the danger of charm, manipulation, and hidden evil. The story of Ted Bundy endures because it reveals how deception and charisma can mask unimaginable violence. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in dark alleys. He was the man who held doors open, who smiled in photographs, who blended seamlessly into society while committing acts of horror. His life is a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come from those who appear the most trustworthy, the most charming, and the most ordinary. And so, Ted Bundy remains a name that chills the world, a story of darkness hidden behind charm, a man whose crimes continue to echo through history as one of the most haunting reminders of what evil can look like when it wears the mask of a friend. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a boy who grew up surrounded by cruelty and pain, a boy who learned early that life was unforgiving, a boy who would become one of the most feared and infamous killers in Brazil. He was called Pedrinho Matador, a man who started killing at the age of 14, and whose path of violence would span decades, leaving a trail of terror, fear, and fascination in its wake. This is the story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, a man who became both a legend and a nightmare. Pedro was born on June 17, 1954, in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, a small town in Brazil. His childhood was far from ordinary. His father was a violent criminal who would abuse him regularly, and his mother struggled to protect him while managing her own struggles in a household consumed by poverty and tension. The streets of Pedro's town were rough, lawless in many ways, and violence was everywhere. He learned quickly that the world could be cruel and that survival often required cunning, strength, and sometimes ruthlessness. From an early age, he saw life and death intertwined, and it fascinated him. By the age of 14, Pedro's fascination with control and violence turned into action. His father, a man who had terrorized him for years, became his first victim. Pedro killed him using a simple blade, acting with a cold efficiency that shocked his small town. But even that first murder was only the beginning. Pedro did not stop there. He began hunting other criminals in his community, men who had committed violent acts, who had harmed innocents, who had evaded justice. In his mind, he became a self-styled executioner, dispensing a dark form of justice with his own hands. During these early years, Pedro's murders were shocking, but also precise. He would track his targets carefully, often observing them for days before making his move. He carried knives and other weapons, always prepared, and he struck with a suddenness that left his victims no time to react. Stories from this period tell of his ability to move quietly, to vanish in the shadows, to leave behind only the evidence he wanted to be discovered, or in many cases, none at all. His reputation began to spread through the towns of Brazil. People whispered his name in fear, some calling him a hero, others calling him a monster, but Pedro remained focused on his own code. As he grew older, his killings became more ambitious. By the 1970s, he was targeting hardened criminals, gang members, and drug traffickers across multiple regions of Brazil. Pedro did not simply kill for thrill or chaos. He had a sense of mission, a dark moral compass that justified his actions in his own mind. He kept track of his victims, noting which had harmed others and which were guilty of serious crimes. Each killing was methodical, each attack carried out with a precision that only years of practice could bring. Eventually, Pedro was captured and sent to prison. But even prison could not contain him. Inside the walls, he continued to hunt. Rival inmates, murderers, and violent criminals became his targets, and Pedro struck them down with the same methodical efficiency he had outside. He transformed his cell blocks into hunting grounds. Stories from prisoners and guards describe him as calm, almost ordinary, until he acted, and then he became unstoppable. He developed a reputation as a man who could not be reasoned with, a man who lived by his own rules, and whose code was absolute. Pedro's time in prison was filled with violence, escapes, and stories that seemed almost impossible. He would fight and kill rivals in prison, often leaving them mutilated. Each act reinforced his legend. By the time he was released, he was both feared and infamous, a man who had learned to survive, thrive, and dominate in the deadliest environments. After his release, Pedro Rodriguez Filho continued to leave his mark. He carried the weight of his reputation, but also the compulsions that had driven him for decades. Over the course of his life, he confessed to killing over 100 people, though many investigators believe the true number may have been even higher. Some victims were children, some were hardened criminals, and some were people who crossed him for minor reasons. Each death followed the same principle. Pedro judged, Pedro executed, and Pedro moved on, leaving fear in his wake. Even today, Pedro's story is one of fascination and horror. He is remembered as both a monster and a vigilante, a man whose life was shaped by cruelty, poverty, and violence, and who responded to that world with a vision that was both terrifying and strangely disciplined. His name endures in Brazilian criminal history, a symbol of what can happen when a child is molded by violence, and when that child grows into a man with an unstoppable drive to punish, to dominate, and to kill. Pedro Rodriguez Filho's life is a story that can hypnotize and terrify, a story of darkness, obsession, and the terrifying power of a mind that has never known mercy. He walked through life as predator and judge, a shadow moving through decades, leaving behind only fear, legends, and unanswered questions about how many lives he truly claimed, and how the world could have produced a man so terrifyingly precise in his violence. Next story. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in the small farming town of Esterville, Iowa. His father was a Danish immigrant who had come to America to build a stable life. He opened a bakery, and from the very beginning, he demanded discipline, responsibility, and obedience from his children. Robert grew up in this strict household where work came before everything else. From his earliest years, Robert was different from other children. He was painfully shy, soft-spoken, and struggled with a stutter that made him the target of cruel jokes. His acne was severe, scarring his face as he entered adolescence. Classmates teased him for his appearance, and every stumble in his speech brought more laughter. School, for most children, was a place to learn and to play. For Robert, it was a place of humiliation. When he wasn't at school, he was working. His father insisted he spend long hours helping in the bakery, waking before dawn to knead dough, carry sacks of flour, and serve customers. The smell of fresh bread filled the air every morning, but for Robert, the bakery was not a place of comfort. It was a place of obligation, where mistakes were not tolerated. He grew up with the weight of expectation pressing down on him. As he entered his teenage years, Robert retreated further into himself. He found it difficult to connect with girls. Whenever he tried, his stutter betrayed him, his acne embarrassed him, and his shyness kept him isolated. He began to develop a simmering resentment toward women. He wanted their attention, but he felt invisible. He wanted their affection, but he was mocked instead. These feelings festered quietly, turning into dark fantasies of revenge. To escape his loneliness, Robert turned to hobbies that didn't require social skills. He learned to hunt. Alone in the woods, rifle in hand, he felt a sense of control he never had around people. He stalked animals patiently, waiting for the perfect shot. Each successful hunt gave him confidence that eluded him in daily life. The wilderness became his sanctuary. It was here that he began blending two worlds, the shame of rejection and the thrill of domination. In 1960, when Robert was 21, his anger boiled over. He set fire to a school bus garage, burning down 3 buses. For this act of arson, he was arrested and sentenced to prison. During his time behind bars, psychologists noted that he had bipolar disorder and antisocial tendencies. But the seriousness of his condition was brushed aside. After serving just 20 months, he was released. Robert tried to start over. He married, divorced, and then remarried. He maintained steady work, returning to the bakery trade, and tried to appear as a normal man. But beneath the surface, his old resentments and fantasies lingered. In the late 1960s, Robert and his second wife moved to Alaska, settling in Anchorage. The move was meant to be a fresh start. Anchorage at the time was a frontier city, rough around the edges but filled with opportunity. Robert opened a bakery of his own, and before long, he became a familiar figure in the community. Customers described him as polite, hard-working, even generous. He provided bread and pastries for neighbors, coached at a local archery club, and raised 2 children with his wife. On the surface, he was an ordinary family man, but his private world told a different story. He continued hunting, and his skill in the wilderness grew legendary. He held records for trophy animals, including moose and sheep, and proudly displayed them. His reputation as a hunter gave him respect, something he had never known in his youth. But his hunting was not confined to animals. In the isolation of Alaska, where vast wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles, Robert found the perfect setting for his darkest fantasies. During the 1970s, Anchorage saw a growing sex trade. Bars, clubs, and streets were filled with women working as dancers or sex workers, many of them transient, with no close ties to the community. To Robert, these women were invisible, just as he had once felt invisible. They became his targets. Robert developed a method that combined his 2 worlds, his resentment toward women and his skill as a hunter. He would approach women with offers of money or by threatening them with a weapon. Once they were under his control, he transported them to his remote cabin or into the wilderness. There, his ritual began. He would sometimes assault them, sometimes restrain them for hours, but eventually he released them into the forest. With his hunting rifle or bow in hand, he pursued them like prey. He stalked them through the trees, watching them stumble over roots and cry out in terror. For Robert, this was the ultimate hunt. He controlled the terrain, the weapons, and the outcome. When he decided the chase was over, he killed them, leaving their bodies buried in shallow graves scattered across the Alaskan landscape. For years, women disappeared around Anchorage. Some bodies were found, others vanished completely, their remains hidden in the vast wilderness. Police noticed the pattern but struggled to identify a suspect. Robert Hansen was the last man anyone would expect. He was a baker, a father, a churchgoer, and a respected hunter. His quiet demeanor hid the predator inside him. In 1983, his crimes began to unravel. A young woman named Cindy Paulson was abducted by Robert. She endured hours of assault, chained and threatened, but when he left her briefly unattended, she seized her chance. Still in shackles, barefoot and terrified, she escaped and ran into the streets. She flagged down a truck driver, who helped her reach the police. Cindy's account was detailed and consistent. She described Robert Hansen's appearance, his car, his home, and the weapons he had used. At first, investigators hesitated. Hansen had no history that fit the profile of such a violent predator. But Cindy's testimony could not be ignored. Detectives began to dig deeper. They discovered inconsistencies in Hansen's alibis and obtained a search warrant for his home. What they uncovered confirmed Cindy's story. Hidden in his property were trophies belonging to missing women, jewelry, identification cards, and other personal items. Most chilling of all was a map. On it, Robert had marked dozens of locations deep in the Alaskan wilderness. Each X represented a burial site. Faced with the evidence, Robert eventually confessed. He admitted to abducting women, releasing them into the wild, and hunting them down. He described the thrill of the chase, the power he felt as his victims fled through the trees, and the satisfaction of killing them. He claimed at least 17 victims, but investigators believe the true number could be closer to 30. In 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. His quiet life as a baker and community man was exposed as a facade, hiding one of the most sadistic killers in American history. He died in 2014, still imprisoned, leaving behind unanswered questions about how many lives he truly ended. To this day, the story of Robert Hansen haunts Alaska. The wilderness, once a place of freedom and beauty, became his hunting ground. The women who vanished into the trees are remembered not only for the horror they endured, but for the silence that allowed him to kill for more than a decade. Next story. Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., into a family whose roots were already tangled with madness. His father was 75 years old when Albert was born, a man far past the usual age of fatherhood, frail and detached. His mother was decades younger, burdened by poverty and responsibility. Around them stretched a city where the divide between wealth and desperation was stark. Some neighborhoods gleamed with prosperity, while others sank into decay. It was in this lower end of society that Albert took his first breaths. From the beginning, instability marked his world. His family carried a long history of mental illness. Relatives had been committed to asylums. Others had been consumed by hallucinations, delusions, or sudden bursts of violence. Into this inheritance of instability, Albert was born small, quiet, and watchful. When Albert was just 5 years old, his father died. The loss left his mother unable to support the family. With no income, she placed him in an orphanage, a decision that would shape his mind in ways no one could have predicted. The orphanage was a place of suffering. Children were beaten regularly, lined up for punishment that came with belts, switches, and whips. The building itself was stark, its walls echoing with cries. For many children, these punishments broke their spirit. But for Albert, they awoke something twisted. He found that the sting of the belt and the burn of the switch did not repel him. Instead, they stirred feelings of excitement. At an age when most children sought comfort, Albert began linking pain with pleasure. He grew older, and the association deepened. Other boys left the orphanage hardened, but still whole. Albert left with compulsions rooted in self-punishment and secret pleasure. He began experimenting with pain on his own body. Later in life, X-rays would reveal dozens of needles embedded deep in his flesh, object he had inserted himself and left there for years. Leaving the orphanage did not mean freedom. His mother struggled, and Albert worked odd jobs. By adolescence, he was already drifting. He discovered that he was attracted to boys, but his desires were tangled with violence. He sought out situations where he could both dominate and hurt, blurring lines between sexuality and cruelty. In his 20s, Albert began wandering from city to city. He worked as a house painter, a handyman, sometimes a servant. His thin frame, gray hair, and quiet demeanor allowed him to blend in. People saw him as a poor, odd little man, never suspecting the storm of fantasies inside him. He married briefly and had 6 children. On the surface, he was a father, feeding his family and living quietly. But even within his home, his darkness showed. He told his children disturbing stories, encouraged violent games, and sometimes stood naked in the house, beating himself with paddles studded with nails. His wife eventually left him, but Albert hardly seemed troubled. His secret life had already consumed him. By the early 1900s, America's growing cities became his hunting ground. Streets filled with immigrants, poor families, and homeless children. Hunger drove many young ones to accept food or work from strangers. Albert learned to exploit this desperation. He would approach children with promises of a meal, candy, or a small job, and then lead them away. Some he assaulted, some he tortured, some he killed. He was not a man of sudden rage, but of ritual. Pain was central to his crimes. He cut, he mutilated, he consumed. Cannibalism became part of his routine. He described it later with chilling calmness, speaking of the taste, the preparation, the details that left investigators shaken. His crimes spread across states. He traveled constantly, drifting from one city to another, and the law could not keep up. Communication between jurisdictions was poor. A missing child in New York had no connection, on paper, to a disappearance in Pennsylvania. Fish used this disarray to vanish into the background again and again. One of his most infamous acts came in 1928 with the Budd family. He originally set his sights on Edward Budd, a young man looking for work. Fish posed as a wealthy farmer offering employment, convincing the family of his kindness. But when he visited their home, he noticed Grace Budd, Edward's 10-year-old sister. On a summer day, he persuaded her parents to let her accompany him to a supposed birthday party. Trusting his appearance as a harmless old man, they allowed it. Grace walked out the door with Albert Fish and never returned. What happened to her was one of the darkest crimes in American history. Fish lured her to an abandoned house, killed her, dismembered her body, and consumed parts of her remains. For years, her disappearance remained a mystery. But Albert Fish's compulsions went further. In one of the most disturbing acts imaginable, he later wrote a detailed letter to Grace Budd's family, describing what he had done. He mailed it directly to their home. The letter was long, rambling, filled with justifications and graphic confessions. It shocked even seasoned investigators. That letter eventually became his downfall. Detectives traced it to a boarding house linked to Fish. From there, they tracked him down and arrested him. At first, he denied involvement, but under questioning, he confessed not only to Grace's murder, but to many others. His confessions spilled out calmly, without emotion, as if he were describing ordinary tasks. He admitted to dozens of crimes, though only a few could be verified. His trial in 1935 drew enormous attention. Reporters filled the courtroom. The public, horrified by the stories, followed every word. Psychiatrists debated whether he was insane. Some described him as psychotic, consumed by delusions. Others argued he was sane but perverse, fully aware of his actions. The jury, after long deliberation, found him guilty and sentenced him to death. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Witnesses reported that he entered the chamber calmly, even eagerly. He had lived a life of pain and cruelty, and in the end, he seemed to embrace death as the final act of his ritual. Next story. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in a small Ukrainian village surrounded by flat fields and forests stretching to the horizon. His life began in a world scarred by hunger and fear. Ukraine had just endured the Holodomor, the man-made famine that claimed millions of lives in the early 1930s. People whispered of families that vanished, of neighbors who never returned from the fields, of desperate parents who turned on their own children. Even as food slowly returned, the shadow of starvation lingered, and every family carried stories of loss. The Chikatilo household was no different. They lived in a one-room hut of rough wood, its roof patched with scraps, the earth floor uneven and cold. Nights were bitter, and chickens and goats shared the space because they were too valuable to leave outside. Privacy did not exist. Young Andrei grew up hearing his parents' whispered arguments, his mother scolding him harshly for bedwetting, and his father's absence looming. Roman, his father, was drafted into the Red Army and captured by the Germans during the Second World War. In the Soviet Union, capture was seen as dishonor. When he finally returned after years in a prisoner of war camp, neighbors spoke of him with contempt, and Andrei carried that stigma. His mother, hardened by deprivation, told him stories meant to wound, that his older brother had disappeared during the famine, taken by neighbors and eaten. Whether true or not, it left a permanent scar on Andrei's imagination. Andrei was a pale, frail child, plagued by health problems and mocked by others. He played little, retreating into books. He devoured history, politics, and literature, losing himself in words. Reading gave him escape, but deepened his isolation. His shyness turned to awkwardness, and his inability to connect with girls filled him with shame. By adolescence, Andrei discovered another humiliation. He was impotent, unable to perform sexually. In a society where masculinity meant strength and virility, this secret filled him with insecurity and anger, even though he tried to hide it behind hard work and study. Determined to rise above his poor beginnings, he pursued education but failed university entrance exams repeatedly. Eventually, he found work as a teacher. Teaching gave him status and control, but also access to students. Soon he crossed boundaries, brushing against them, exposing himself, touching them. Parents complained, but Soviet bureaucracy prized silence. Instead of punishment, he was quietly transferred from one school to another, his record unmarked, giving him freedom to continue. In 1978, Chikatilo committed his first known murder. He lured 9-year-old Yelena to a house he had just purchased, offering treats and companionship. When she resisted, he panicked. His impotence again left him frustrated, and in frenzy he stabbed her repeatedly. Her body was dumped in a nearby river. Another man was falsely accused, convicted, and executed. Andrei walked free. That failure of justice sealed the fate of many more. Once he realized murder relieved his tension, he could not stop. Train stations and bus stops became his hunting grounds. These were filled with children running errands, teenagers traveling, women visiting family. Many were vulnerable, poor, or alone. With his glasses and quiet demeanor, he appeared harmless, even trustworthy. One by one, he led them away, into forests where the wind drowned their cries, into fields where only the rustle of grass bore witness, into abandoned buildings where silence ruled. His attacks were frenzied, stabbing over and over, sometimes dozens of times. He mutilated genitals, gouged eyes, carved flesh. For him, killing became both release and ritual. For investigators, the murders were a nightmare. In the Soviet Union of the 1980s, serial killing was not acknowledged. To admit it was to admit weakness in the state. Each case was filed separately, while police were pressured to close investigations quickly. Innocent men were accused, interrogated, even executed, while the true killer walked free. By the mid-1980s, fear spread across the Rostov region. Parents warned children not to linger at stations. Villagers whispered of a monster. Bodies kept appearing, their condition too horrific to describe. In 1984, Chikatilo was briefly arrested, his behavior suspicious, his history troubling, but there was no physical evidence. He was released. The killings resumed almost immediately. Over the next years, the body count grew. He killed boys, girls, young women, sometimes several in quick succession. At one point, 4 victims in just 2 weeks. Each time, the frenzy deepened. His compulsion no longer had limits. By 1990, with the Soviet Union itself crumbling, authorities finally assembled a full task force. Investigators mapped murders, tracked patterns, and watched stations. One cold November day, they saw Chikatilo lingering at a Rostov station, circling young women. When stopped, he carried a knife, rope, and stained clothing. This time, he was not released. In custody, he resisted at first. Days stretched into nights. Then he began to speak. Confessions poured out. 52 murders described calmly, even proudly, with details only the killer could know. His 1992 trial was infamous. The courtroom was packed. Families of victims screamed at him, their grief spilling into rage. Chikatilo behaved erratically, shouting, stripping, pretending madness. But the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of 52 murders. On February 14, 1994, in a Rostov prison, Andrei Chikatilo was executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head. He was buried in an unmarked grave. He was called the Butcher of Rostov, the Red Ripper, a man shaped by famine, war, humiliation, and anger, whose compulsions thrived in a system too rigid to stop him. For more than a decade, he stalked train stations and villages, preying on the vulnerable, leaving behind a legacy of fear that lingers even today. Next story. David Parker Ray was born on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico. His childhood, like so many of the men who would later descend into violence, was steeped in instability. His father was an abusive alcoholic who beat his wife and children, and his mother, unable to endure the cruelty, eventually abandoned the family. David and his sister were left to be raised by their strict grandparents. Growing up, David was quiet, withdrawn, awkward. He was bullied in school, mocked for his shyness, his lack of confidence, his inability to connect with others. Teachers remembered him as intelligent but distracted, always drifting somewhere inside his own head. The seeds of something darker were being planted. As a teenager, he discovered pornography, but not the harmless kind. He gravitated toward violent, sadistic images, drawings of torture, magazines that depicted women's suffering. He began collecting them, hiding them, building a secret world that he fed with violent fantasies. Those fantasies grew. Soon he was sketching his own images, women tied up, chained, tortured. His classmates saw hints of this, but in the conservative, rural world of 1950s New Mexico, such things were quietly ignored. By the time he reached adulthood, David was a man divided. On the surface, he lived an ordinary life. He joined the army, trained as a mechanic, learned discipline and skill with machines. After his service, he returned to civilian life and worked steady jobs, including as a state park maintenance man. People who met him often described him as polite, soft-spoken, even gentle. But beneath the mask, his private world of violence and control was growing larger and more elaborate. Ray eventually married and divorced several times. Each marriage collapsed under the weight of his hidden obsessions. His partners described him as secretive, cold, unable to form normal intimacy. Meanwhile, his fantasies escalated. He dreamed not only of hurting women, but of creating a place where he could fully control them, a space designed for torment, for domination, for his darkest desires. That dream became reality in a soundproof trailer he built in the desert outside of Elephant Butte, New Mexico. The trailer became known as the Toy Box. Inside, Ray constructed what looked like a torture chamber. There were chains, pulleys, clamps, whips, surgical tools, and even homemade devices built for inflicting pain. He wired the space with restraints and recording equipment. He decorated the walls with diagrams of naked women in chains, charts showing methods of torture, and shelves lined with implements designed for cruelty. Before bringing victims into this space, Ray recorded an audio tape, a chilling introduction. When a woman awoke, bound and disoriented inside the toy box, Ray would play the tape. On it, his calm, steady voice explained in graphic detail what would happen to her, how long she might live, and the rules she was expected to follow. The tape stripped away all hope. It told them they were no longer human beings, only objects, toys to be used until he tired of them. Ray did not work alone. He often involved women in his crimes, including his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, who helped lure victims and maintain control. Together, they kidnapped women, often sex workers or runaways, those society overlooked. Victims were drugged, bound, and transported to the toy box. Some survived to tell their stories. Others vanished without a trace. Authorities believe there may have been dozens of victims, but the desert kept its secrets well. For years, his crimes went undetected. Victims who escaped often struggled to be believed. Their accounts sounded too horrific, too bizarre. Local police dismissed them as unreliable, thinking no man could possibly construct such a place or carry out such acts. Ray exploited this disbelief, confident that his victims' voices would vanish in the wind. It all unraveled in 1999. A woman named Cynthia Vigil was abducted by Ray and Cindy Hendy. She was chained and tortured in the toy box, but through sheer determination, she managed to escape. Naked, bruised, and still chained, she fled into the street and found help. Her testimony gave law enforcement the evidence they needed to search Ray's property. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators. The trailer was worse than the victims had described. Every inch of it confirmed the stories, the instruments of torture, the recordings, the diagrams. It was not fantasy. It was real. Ray was arrested. During interrogation, he remained calm, almost casual about what he had built. He denied killing anyone, claiming he only tortured and released his victims, but police suspected otherwise. Too many women had vanished in the area over the years. Too many stories lined up with his methods. Despite extensive searches, bodies were never recovered, buried perhaps in the remote desert, hidden forever by time and sand. His trial was long and complex. as prosecutors worked to piece together cases without the physical remains of victims. Ultimately, he was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping and torture. He was sentenced to over 200 years in prison. Cindy Hendy, his accomplice, also received a lengthy sentence after testifying against him. But Ray himself never served his full punishment. In 2002, only 3 years after his arrest, he died of a heart attack in prison. He took with him the full truth of his crimes, the number of victims, their names, the locations of their bodies. To this day, the toy box killer remains one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, not only for the cruelty he inflicted, but for the methodical, organized way he built a world for his obsessions. His trailer stood as a monument to the darkest parts of the human mind, a place where suffering was engineered with precision. For the people of New Mexico, the desert will always hold a shadow, the memory of a man who used its vastness to hide his crimes, and the haunting thought of how many voices were silenced there. Next story. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. From the very beginning, his life was marked by instability. His family was troubled. His father was strict, controlling, and often abusive. His mother struggled with her own mental health, and the home environment was filled with tension, anger, and fear. For a young boy, there was little comfort. As a child, Richard began showing signs that something was wrong. He was withdrawn, awkward, and unable to form strong connections with others. He had trouble following rules, and his behavior became more disturbing as he grew. Neighbors and teachers noticed early warning signs. He set small fires. He displayed cruelty toward animals, and he went to bed far beyond the age when most children stopped. This trio of behaviors, often called the McDonald Triad, would later be studied as common markers in the backgrounds of violent offenders. In adolescence, Richard became more isolated. He had almost no friends. He was painfully shy around girls, but beneath that shyness was frustration and anger. He also developed health obsessions. He complained constantly about his body, convinced that something was wrong with him. He believed his heart would stop beating, that his blood was turning to powder, that his stomach was rotting from the inside. Doctors found no evidence of these things, but his mind refused to let go of the delusions. By his teenage years, Richard began experimenting with drugs, marijuana, LSD, and later stronger substances. These only fueled his paranoia. His mental health spiraled. He became convinced that he was losing control of his body. He thought his blood was disappearing, that he was dying of strange internal diseases. In his desperate search for answers, he began to develop bizarre coping mechanisms. Richard believed that drinking the blood of animals could keep him alive. He began capturing small creatures, rabbits, cats, dogs, even birds. He would kill them, drink their blood, and sometimes consume their raw organs. To him, this was not cruelty. In his delusional mind, it was survival. He believed blood gave him strength, that it restored what he thought his body lacked. His obsession with blood grew. He started injecting animal blood into his veins, an act that caused serious infections. His family became alarmed. Eventually, he was placed in a psychiatric hospital. There, staff quickly realized how disturbed he was. He was caught killing birds that landed near the hospital, drinking their blood in secret. Other patients called him Dracula. Despite his behavior, after treatment with medication, Richard was released. Doctors believed he could function outside with supervision. But once free, he stopped taking his medication. His delusions returned stronger than before. He moved into a small apartment in Sacramento, where his strange behavior escalated. Neighbors noticed he walked around naked, smeared with blood. He covered his walls and furniture in animal remains. He became thinner, more paranoid, more disconnected from reality. In 1977, Richard committed his first known murder. He shot and killed a man in a drive-by shooting, chosen at random. Police found the crime puzzling, with no clear motive or suspect. Richard had killed to see if he could, and having done so, he wanted more. What followed in January of 1978 shocked Sacramento and became the reason for his nickname, the Vampire of Sacramento. Richard targeted homes where he believed the doors were unlocked. He said later that if a door was locked, it was a sign he wasn't welcome. But if it was open, it meant fate allowed him inside. On January 23rd, he entered the home of a young woman named Teresa Wallen. She was pregnant at the time. Richard shot her, then mutilated her body. He performed acts of necrophilia, drank her blood, and removed organs, taking them home with him. The crime scene was horrific, one of the most brutal investigators had ever seen. 4 days later, on January 27th, Richard struck again. This time, he entered the home of the Muroth family. Inside were 38-year-old Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew, and a family friend. Richard murdered all of them with his gun. He then mutilated Evelyn, drinking her blood and consuming parts of her body. He took the toddler from the scene, later killing him and discarding his body. Sacramento was thrown into panic. The crimes were savage, the scenes unimaginable. Police launched one of the largest manhunts in the city's history. Witnesses described a strange, gaunt man driving a rusted station wagon. Tips poured in, and soon suspicion focused on Richard Chase. Detectives found his apartment. Inside, the stench was overwhelming. The walls, floors, and kitchen were covered in blood. Cups filled with blood sat on counters. Refrigerators stored organs. It was a house of horror. On January 28, 1978, police arrested Richard Chase. He did not resist. In custody, he calmly explained his reasoning. He believed he had to drink blood to survive. He said Nazis were poisoning him, that his blood was drying up, that he was keeping himself alive by consuming others. He spoke with a flat, detached tone, describing horrors as if they were routine. At his trial, the defense argued insanity. Clearly, his delusions and behavior pointed to severe schizophrenia. But the jury, horrified by the details of the crimes, convicted him of 6 murders and sentenced him to death in a gas chamber. Richard Chase never made it to execution. In 1980, while awaiting death, he hoarded medication prescribed for depression. He took an overdose in his cell, ending his own life at the age of 30. His story remains one of the most disturbing in American crime history, not only for the brutality of the murders, but for the window it opened into the mind of a man consumed by delusion. To Richard Chase, blood was life, and in his madness, he turned Sacramento into a city of fear, leaving behind a legacy that still chills those who study his case. Next story. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons in a working-class family. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary, was a retail sales clerk. The family lived a modest life, struggling financially at times, but always trying to maintain appearances of normalcy. From the outside, their household seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls lay tensions and patterns of dysfunction that would later be seen as critical to the making of killer. As a child, Gary was shy and slow to develop academically. He struggled with reading comprehension and was held back in school more than once. Teachers noticed that he seemed detached, often staring off or failing to grasp lessons. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his lack of intelligence, and he grew up with a deep sense of inferiority. This sense of being less than others would stay with him for life, shaping the way he related to people. At home, the Ridgway family environment was strained. Gary's father often complained about sex workers, speaking of them with contempt. He frequently shared disturbing stories about encounters he had witnessed while driving his bus route near Seattle, where prostitution was common. At the same time, Gary's relationship with his mother was complicated. She was described as domineering, strict, and sometimes humiliating toward him. Gary later spoke of feeling confused by his mother's behavior, especially when she scolded him harshly, even as she also cared for him physically in ways that left him with troubling, conflicted emotions. As Gary entered adolescence, he began to show troubling signs of suppressed rage. At the age of 16, in what would later be remembered as a shocking foreshadowing of his adult crimes, he lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The child survived, But the act revealed a dangerous side of Gary that no one around him truly recognized or understood at the time. It was brushed off as an isolated incident, and Gary moved forward with his life as though nothing had happened. After finishing high school, Gary joined the Navy. He was deployed to Vietnam, where he was exposed to the chaos of war and the widespread use of sex workers among soldiers. He contracted gonorrhea during his service, which filled him with a mixture of guilt and anger, emotions that later became tied to his view of women. When his military service ended, he returned to the United States and settled near Seattle. Gary Ridgway married young, taking a woman named Claudia Craig as his first wife in 1970. But their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He was jealous, controlling, and consumed by suspicions of infidelity. His fixation on sexual activity was overwhelming, and his expectations in the marriage were exhausting to his partner. They divorced within a year. He would marry more than once again, and in each relationship he displayed a disturbing pattern of obsession, control, and infidelity. On the surface, Ridgway lived a seemingly ordinary working-class life. He was employed as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he remained for decades. His co-workers described him as quiet, sometimes odd, but generally reliable. He attended church regularly and sometimes read the Bible aloud at home. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, he was nurturing dark fantasies and behaviors that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The murders that would later be attributed to him began in the early 1980s in the area surrounding the Green River near Seattle. In 1982, the body of a young woman was found in the river. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered, all of them women, many of them known to be sex workers or runaways. The victims were often strangled, sometimes with ligatures, and their bodies were left in wooded areas, ravines, or the river itself. The pattern became clear to investigators. They were dealing with a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his vehicle, murdered them, and then disposed of their bodies in clusters across the landscape. The press soon dubbed him the Green River Killer, a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in American history. Task forces were formed, dozens of detectives and FBI profilers were assigned, and yet the killer remained elusive. Ridgway himself was interviewed as early as 1983. He admitted to knowing some of the victims and to picking up sex workers, but he was calm, cooperative, and passed a polygraph test. Without concrete evidence, the investigators let him go. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to accumulate. Throughout the 1980s, women kept vanishing from the Seattle area, many of them last seen near Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road notorious for prostitution. Their remains were later found in clusters in wooded dumping sites that Ridgway returned to more than once. He often revisited the corpses to perform acts of necrophilia, an element of his crimes that remained hidden until his eventual confessions. For years, the task force chased leads, investigated suspects, and tried new forensic methods. Among those who assisted was Robert Keppel, a detective who had previously investigated Ted Bundy. Bundy himself, sitting on death row in Florida at the time, even offered to help profile the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer likely revisited the bodies and that he chose vulnerable women because he knew their disappearances would draw less attention. At the time, investigators considered Bundy's insights, but still lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway's double life continued into the 1990s. He remarried, held his job steadily, and maintained a bland suburban existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, sometimes friendly, sometimes odd. Few suspected that the quiet man who mowed his lawn and attended barbecues was hiding the darkest of secrets. The break in the case came with the advancement of DNA technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, samples that had been preserved from the victims were tested using new methods. Semen found on several victims was matched conclusively to Gary Ridgway. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, Ridgway was finally arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. Many could not reconcile the ordinary factory worker with the monstrous crimes. In custody, Ridgway eventually confessed to an astonishing number of murders. He admitted to killing at least 70 women, though he was only formally convicted of 49. His confessions revealed chilling details. He spoke matter-of-factly, with no visible remorse, explaining how he chose women he thought no one would miss, how he strangled them in his truck or home, and how he returned to their bodies long after their deaths. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He led investigators to previously undiscovered remains and described his methods in cold detail. The families of the victims attended hearings, listening as he recounted the deaths of their loved ones. For many, it was a devastating experience, but it also brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving his time at the Washington State Penitentiary. He remains there to this day, one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Story 2. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a blue-collar family of Polish and Danish descent. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist who carried the scars of alcoholism and a violent temper. His mother, Marion, was described as a kind and protective woman who tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's anger. John Wayne, known in the family simply as Johnny, was the second of 3 children, with 2 sisters who were close to him throughout his life. From an early age, Gacy's relationship with his father was one of fear and disappointment. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him weak and stupid, mocking him for not being athletic, and sometimes beating him for minor infractions. Johnny longed for approval that never came. Even as he grew older and achieved small successes, his father dismissed him. His mother, on the other hand, offered him compassion and defended him from his father's abuse. But this only deepened the wedge between father and son. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems. He experienced fainting spells and was later diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that limited his ability to participate in sports. This weakness made him a target of bullying from peers and further scorn from his father, who saw physical strength as a mark of manhood. These early wounds of rejection and humiliation would stay with him for life. Despite his struggles, Gacy showed an ability to charm and make friends. He had a sociable nature and often tried to win people over with humor and friendliness. By his teenage years, he became active in community organizations, working in grocery stores, and showing leadership qualities that impressed many around him. Yet behind this affable exterior, he carried secrets of confusion about his identity, his desires, and his insecurities. After finishing high school, Gacy moved through a series of jobs, eventually finding work in management positions. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964, and the couple settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where her family owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy managed 3 of these restaurants, earning a good salary and presenting himself as a respectable young businessman. He joined the JCs, a civic organization where he rose quickly through the ranks, known for his enthusiasm and his ability to get others involved. But beneath this respectable exterior, Gacy harbored dark impulses. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy, an offense that shattered the image he had worked so hard to build. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and his wife divorced him, taking their 2 children and severing all ties. After serving just 18 months, Gacy was released in 1970 for good behavior. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life, but the seeds of his future crimes had already been planted. Back in Chicago, Gacy reinvented himself. He started a successful construction business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried, this time to a woman named Carol Hoff, a divorced mother with 2 daughters. They moved into a house on Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared to be a model citizen. He hosted parties, often cooking elaborate meals, and became involved in local Democratic Party politics. One of Gacy's most unusual hobbies was performing as a clown. He created two characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, sewing the costumes himself and painting his own face. He entertained children at hospitals, charity events, and parades, earning him the nickname the Killer Clown in later years. To those who saw him perform, he seemed harmless, even joyful. Yet this persona masked the terrifying reality of what was happening inside his home. Throughout the 1970s, young men and boys began disappearing in the Chicago area. Many of them were runaways, drifters, or youth-seeking work. Gacy often lured them with promises of construction jobs or money. Some he picked up hitchhiking, others he met at bus stations or on the street. Once inside his home, he would offer them alcohol or show them a trick involving handcuffs, claiming he could demonstrate how to escape. When they were restrained, he revealed his true intentions. He assaulted them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, layering the bodies in trenches that he dug himself. Others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. His ability to maintain his public image while committing these crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Suspicion grew slowly. Some families of the missing reported seeing their sons last with Gacy, and rumors circulated. In 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest became the turning point. Piest was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had offered him a job. When he failed to return home, his parents alerted the police, who quickly connected his disappearance to Gacy. A surveillance operation was launched. Detectives followed Gacy, noting his erratic behavior and eventually obtaining a search warrant for his home. What they discovered shocked them. The smell of decomposition in the house was overwhelming. In the crawl space, they began to find bodies, one after another, buried in the earth. The scale of the crime was almost beyond comprehension. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he confessed in chilling detail to the murders. He spoke casually of how he killed the boys, describing them as if they were objects rather than human beings. The trial began in 1980 and lasted for weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense tried to argue insanity. But the jury was unmoved. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in United States history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For years, he lived on death row at Menard Correctional Center, appealing his sentence and maintaining at times that he was innocent, at other times admitting to the crimes. He became a notorious figure, even creating paintings that were sold for high prices by collectors morbidly fascinated with him. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the horror of his crimes. His last words were dismissive, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a deep scar on the Chicago community and the families of his victims. His ability to live a double life, to be a businessman, a community volunteer, and a clown who entertained children, while at the same time burying dozens of bodies beneath his home, remains one of the most chilling examples of hidden evil. His case also led to greater awareness of the need for better investigations into missing persons, especially those from vulnerable groups. Story 3. The story of Peter Sutcliffe, later known to the world as the Yorkshire Ripper, begins in a quiet and ordinary setting, one that gave little hint of the darkness that would one day emerge. Born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, in 1946, Sutcliffe grew up in a working-class family in post-war England. His early life was marked by a somewhat withdrawn personality, a boy who seemed more comfortable in solitude than in crowds. Teachers and peers noticed that he was shy and sometimes awkward, but there was little outward sign of what was to come. The landscape of his childhood was one of smoky industrial towns, strict social structures, and families trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. As Sutcliffe grew older, those who knew him recalled a young man who seemed caught between the ordinary expectations of life and a deeper sense of disconnection. He worked various jobs, including in a factory and later as a truck driver, but he never seemed to settle. His relationships were strained, though he eventually married Sonia Surma in 1974, a woman who would remain by his side through much of the turmoil that was to follow. Their marriage was unusual, marked by long separations and a lack of intimacy, which only deepened Sutcliffe's sense of isolation. The crimes that would bring his name into infamy began in the mid-1970s. Between 1975 and 1980, women in the north of England began to be attacked with shocking brutality. Many were sex workers, living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. Others were simply ordinary women going about their daily routines. The killings were marked by a distinctive pattern, with the use of a hammer and a sharpened instrument that inflicted terrible injuries. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and deeply violent, leaving behind scenes of horror that confounded the police and terrified the public. The press quickly seized upon the fear, labeling the unknown killer the Yorkshire Ripper, an echo of the Victorian-era Jack the Ripper murders in London. The name stuck, and with it came a wave of public panic. Women across the north of England lived under a shadow of dread, avoiding nighttime travel, staying in groups, and fearing the possibility that the next victim could be anyone. The climate of fear grew so severe that it reshaped social life, particularly for women, and placed immense pressure on law enforcement to find the culprit. The investigation, however, was plagued by mistakes. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history, interviewing thousands of men, compiling endless files of information, and struggling under the weight of both public expectation and their own internal errors. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax. A man with a strong Sunderland accent sent letters and tapes to the police claiming to be the killer. The police, convinced of the authenticity of the recordings, diverted significant resources to focus on suspects with similar accents. In reality, the letters and tapes were fraudulent, later proven to have been sent by John Samuel Humble, a man with no connection to the actual murders. This misdirection allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killings while the investigation drifted off course. By the end of the decade, the list of victims had grown. Women such as Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, and many more had lost their lives in horrifying circumstances. Some victims were young women with children, others elderly, some students or shop assistants. Each case carried with it grief and devastation for families and communities, while the broader society lived with the constant unease of not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. Despite being interviewed by the police multiple times, Sutcliffe managed to avoid capture. He explained away inconsistencies, charmed his way out of suspicion, and benefited from the disorganization of the investigation. Files were misplaced, connections were overlooked, and the sheer scale of the inquiry left gaps through which Sutcliffe slipped repeatedly. The frustration of the detectives mounted, and the anger of the public grew. Women's rights groups organized protests, demanding greater safety and accountability, and criticizing the police for failing to protect the vulnerable. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was arrested in Sheffield after police officers noticed false number plates on his car. Inside the vehicle, they discovered tools that connected him to the series of murders. Further investigation revealed bloodstains, weapons, and other evidence that left little doubt as to his guilt. Once in custody, Sutcliffe confessed to many of the murders, speaking in a detached and almost casual manner that shocked investigators. He claimed that he had been commanded by voices, a supposed divine directive to rid the world of prostitutes. Whether this was a genuine delusion or an attempt to craft a defense is still debated, but it became a central element of his trial. In May 1981, Sutcliffe stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings gripped the nation as the court heard testimony about the murders, the botched investigation, and Sutcliffe's mental state. His defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, the jury rejected this, and Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in prison, a sentence later upgraded to a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never be released. The aftermath of the case left lasting scars on British society. Families of the victims struggled with grief for decades, while the surviving victims bore the trauma of their attacks. The failures of the police investigation led to a major public inquiry, which criticized the West Yorkshire police for their mishandling of the case and recommended sweeping reforms. The Wearside Jack hoaxer was eventually unmasked and imprisoned years later, adding another tragic dimension to the story of misdirection and lost lives. Sutcliffe himself spent the rest of his life in custody, moving between prisons and psychiatric facilities. He was attacked several times by fellow inmates and lived under heavy guard. His health declined in later years, and he died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19, bringing an end to the life of a man whose crimes had cast a shadow over an entire generation. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most haunting chapters in British criminal history. It is a tale not only of violence and cruelty, but also of systemic failure, public fear, and the resilience of those who demanded justice. It reveals how the actions of one man can alter the lives of countless others, and how institutions meant to protect can falter under pressure. For decades, it has served as a cautionary reminder of the need for vigilance, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable. Story 4. The story of Richard Ramirez, who would become infamously known as the Night Stalker, begins far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, in El Paso, Texas, where he was born in February 1960. He grew up in a troubled household, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was strict and often abusive, and young Richard, called Richie by his family, began spending long hours away from home to avoid conflict. He slept in cemeteries as a child. He wandered the streets at night, and he grew up surrounded by influences that were anything but stable. From an early age, Ramirez was exposed to violence and darkness that would shape him forever. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran who returned from the war with photographs of atrocities and stories of brutality. Miguel would show these images to the impressionable boy and brag about acts of violence he committed overseas. Even more horrifying, Miguel once shot his wife in front of Richard, an act of domestic murder that Ramirez witnessed firsthand as a teenager. This exposure to blood and death left a deep imprint. Ramirez's adolescence spiraled further into delinquency. He experimented with drugs, including LSD, and developed a fascination with Satanism, black magic, and horror. He idolized serial killers and murderers, studying their crimes as if they were role models. By his late teens, he was committing burglaries, drifting between jobs, and spending nights wandering city streets. Eventually, he left Texas for California, where the anonymity of Los Angeles provided the perfect landscape for his descent into crime. The wave of violence that earned him his place in history began in 1984. The first known murder linked to him was that of Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in her Los Angeles apartment. Her death bore the hallmarks of the savagery that would characterize many of his crimes: forced entry, overwhelming violence, and sexual assault. At first, the murder seemed isolated, but within months, the pattern grew. In 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror. Ramirez embarked on a spree of home invasions, murders, rapes, and assaults that appeared almost random in their targets. He attacked the young and the elderly, men and women, people of different races and backgrounds. No one felt safe because there was no clear profile of who might be next. He entered homes at night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and his victims woke to unspeakable violence. Some were shot, others stabbed, many bludgeoned. He left behind scenes of horror that investigators struggled to connect at first, but soon the public and police alike realized they were facing one of the most sadistic criminals in modern American history. Ramirez developed a ritualistic pattern. He used guns, knives, or blunt objects. He often assaulted women sexually, sometimes in front of their partners or children. He forced his victims to swear to Satan, leaving behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into skin. The press seized on these satanic connections, fueling fear that the Night Stalker was not merely a murderer, but part of something even darker. The city of Los Angeles descended into paranoia. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns. People double-bolted doors, installed alarms, and slept with weapons nearby. The heat of the summer in 1985 made this even more difficult, as residents kept their windows closed in fear. Every creak of the night became a cause for panic. The randomness of Ramirez's targets made him particularly terrifying. Unlike other killers who focused on specific types of victims, Ramirez struck without pattern, so no one felt safe. The police worked tirelessly, but Ramirez proved elusive. He used stolen cars, switched weapons, and left behind little that could lead directly to him. He killed in Los Angeles, but also traveled north to San Francisco, committing murders there as well, widening the scope of the hunt. A breakthrough came when a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car matched Richard Ramirez, whose criminal record included prior arrests. His face was soon plastered across newspapers and television screens, and the entire state knew his name. The capture of Richard Ramirez was almost cinematic in its drama. In August 1985, a resident in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a newspaper photo. By chance, Ramirez had entered a local store and noticed his own face staring back at him from headlines. He attempted to flee, but was chased by a group of local residents. They cornered him, beat him, and held him down until police arrived. The Night Stalker had been brought down not by elite detectives, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him escape. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history. Beginning in 1989, it stretched on for months, marked by shocking testimony, graphic evidence, and Ramirez's own disturbing behavior. He frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouted "Hail Satan" in court, and showed no remorse. His demeanor made him both feared and strangely idolized. Some followers wrote him love letters and attended his trial, drawn to his image as a dark antihero. But for the families of his victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal, forcing them to relive the horrors inflicted by a man who seemed to revel in their pain. Ultimately, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury sentenced him to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Even in prison, Ramirez remained a figure of fascination and revulsion. He married a woman who had written to him while incarcerated, though their relationship eventually faded. He lived under the shadow of execution for more than 2 decades, appealing his conviction but never escaping his fate. In 2013, before his death sentence could be carried out, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma, ending his life behind bars. The legacy of Richard Ramirez's crimes is one of terror, sorrow, and unanswered questions. His victims and their families live with scars that never fully heal. The communities he terrorized remember the summer of 1985 as a time when fear was constant, when the Night Stalker seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His case also changed the way Americans understood crime, highlighting the vulnerability of ordinary households and the randomness of violence. The Night Stalker remains a chilling symbol of predatory cruelty, a man whose actions revealed the darkest corners of human capability. His story endures not because of who he was, but because of the devastating impact he had on countless innocent lives, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when confronted with evil. Story 5. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, who became known to the world as the BTK Killer, begins in the small city of Wichita, Kansas, a place that for many years felt far removed from the kind of horrors that would eventually unfold there. Dennis Rader was born in March of 1945 in the tiny community of Pittsburgh, Kansas, before his family eventually moved to Wichita. From the outside, he seemed to grow up in an ordinary Midwestern household, with both parents working hard to provide for their children. Yet even in his childhood, troubling patterns began to emerge. He later admitted that from a young age he experienced violent sexual fantasies, often imagining scenarios where he bound and controlled women. These fantasies never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger as he matured, becoming the foundation for the crimes that would terrorize Kansas for decades. Rader graduated from high school in 1963 and spent a brief time in college before enlisting in the United States Air Force. He served from 1966 until 1970, and after returning to Kansas, he attempted to live what looked like an ordinary life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, settled down in the Wichita area, found steady work first in a meat packing plant and later with an outdoor supply company, and eventually became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He was also active in his church congregation, even serving as president of the church council. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed strict and somewhat odd, but far from dangerous. No one could have imagined the hidden life he was leading. The first known murders attributed to Rader occurred in January of 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero and two of their young children. What unfolded that morning was an act of unimaginable violence. Rader bound each member of the family with cords and methodically killed them one by one. The brutality of the Otero murders stunned Wichita and immediately led police to believe a highly dangerous individual was at large. Yet investigators had few leads. There were no suspects, no clear motive, and no connection between the victims and a possible killer. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated tragedy, but soon afterward Rader made it clear he wanted recognition. In October of 1970, a local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter described details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. Most chillingly, the writer signed the letter with the initials BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. That phrase would become inseparable from the crimes and the identity of the man who committed them. Over the following years, Rader struck again. In April 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, a young woman he attacked in her home after following her. 2 years later, in March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a mother whose children he locked in a bathroom while he carried out the crime. In December of that same year, he killed Nancy Fox, an attack he later called one of his most significant. Rader continued to taunt police and media through letters and poems, always signing them BTK. His communications revealed a desire for notoriety and control. He wanted to ensure his crimes would not be forgotten and that his name would instill fear. Despite the communications, investigators struggled to identify the killer. The crimes appeared carefully planned, and the letters revealed a disturbing intelligence. Task forces were formed, tips poured in, but the identity of BTK remained elusive. By the early 1980s, Rader seemed to go quiet. In reality, he had not stopped having violent fantasies, but he began spacing out his attacks, making them harder to connect. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street from him. He later confessed to hiding her body in the church where he served as council president, posing her in different positions before disposing of her remains. In September 1986, he killed Vicki Weggerl, leaving behind her husband as the one to find her bound and strangled. At the time, police did not realize this crime was connected to BTK, and it was only later confirmed through DNA evidence. His final known murder occurred in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, again abducting her from her home and leaving her body in a rural area outside Wichita. After that, Rader appeared to go dormant. For more than a decade, there were no known BTK murders, and many in Wichita began to believe the killer had either died or moved away. During this time, Rader continued living his outwardly normal life. He raised 2 children, maintained his job as a compliance officer where he enforced petty city codes with almost obsessive rigor, and remained active in his church. Those who knew him described him as strict, rule-bound, and somewhat controlling, but nothing that pointed to a secret double life as a serial killer. Then in 2004, more than 30 years after the first Otero murders, Wichita received a shock. BTK resurfaced. A local television station received a package containing photographs and a copy of Vicki Weggerl's driver's license, stolen from the crime scene years earlier. This was undeniable proof that the killer was still alive and wanted attention once again. Over the next year, a series of communications arrived at media outlets and police all from BTK. He sent packages containing crime scene items, letters describing his actions, and puzzles meant to taunt investigators. These new communications proved to be Rader's undoing. In one package, he asked police if they could trace information from a computer floppy disk. Investigators responded publicly through a newspaper ad suggesting it would be safe. When Rader eventually sent a floppy disk, forensic analysis revealed metadata linking the document to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis Rader. Investigators quickly confirmed that DNA taken from Rader's daughter matched evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home in Park City. The news stunned the community. This man who had lived among them for decades, enforcing local codes and serving as a church leader, was now unmasked as the BTK killer. During interrogations, Rader calmly confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, instead speaking about them as projects he had planned and executed. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, though he hinted at more crimes that could not be conclusively proven. In court, he pleaded guilty, giving a long and detailed confession that described each murder step by step. His demeanor was cold and matter-of-fact, horrifying the families of victims who listened in the courtroom. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today. His case continues to be studied for the way he maintained a double life, the methods he used to communicate with the public and law enforcement, and the failures and eventual success of the investigation that captured him. The aftermath of the BTK case left lasting scars on Wichita. For decades, families had lived in fear, never knowing who among them might secretly be BTK. The revelation that he was an ordinary neighbor and community leader was almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Next story. The story of Aileen Wuornos begins not in the chaos of her crimes, but in the turbulence of her early childhood. She was born in February 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, to a teenage mother and a father who would never play a role in her life. Her father was a convicted child molester who ended up in prison, later taking his own life, and her mother abandoned Aileen and her brother when Aileen was only a toddler. The two children were left to the care of their grandparents, a home that was supposed to provide safety, but instead became another environment of instability and abuse. Aileen's grandfather was a violent man, and her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. From an early age, Aileen experienced neglect, violence, and exploitation. By the time she was 11 years old, she had already begun trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money, surviving in a world that offered her no protection. She became pregnant as a teenager after being assaulted, and her baby was given up for adoption. Soon after, she was expelled from her home, left to survive entirely on her own. Her teenage years unfolded on the margins of society. She hitchhiked across states, lived outdoors, and engaged in sex work to sustain herself. Aileen's life became a cycle of transient relationships, brushes with the law, and survival through whatever means she could find. She was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and disorderly conduct. The years hardened her, stripping away any sense of stability or belonging. By the late 1980s, Wuornos was living in Florida, still drifting and surviving as a sex worker along highways. It was there, beginning in 1989, that her violent crimes began. Unlike many serial killers who targeted specific groups for twisted psychological reasons, Wuornos' murders were bound up with her own life circumstances. She claimed she killed men who had picked her up for sex when they became violent or attempted to assault her. But prosecutors would later argue her crimes were calculated robberies, carried out under the guise of self-defense. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man who picked her up along a Florida highway. In December 1989, his body was discovered abandoned in his car, shot multiple times. At first, the murder seemed like an isolated case, but over the next year, more bodies appeared. The victims were all men, found along roadsides or in wooded areas, killed with a gun and often robbed of their belongings or vehicles. As the body count rose, eventually reaching 7 confirmed murders, fear spread through Central Florida. Police connected the killings by the consistent method and by witness descriptions of a woman seen with some of the victims shortly before their deaths. A key detail helped narrow the search. Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore, had crashed one of the victims' cars and fled the scene, leaving behind fingerprints. Those prints were traced back to Wuornos, already known to law enforcement for her long history of arrests. Investigators began a manhunt, but Wuornos was elusive, moving from cheap motels to bars, living in constant motion. In January 1991, police finally caught her at a biker bar in Daytona Beach. She was arrested without incident, though she maintained a tough and defiant demeanor. Her partner, Tyria Moore, became a crucial figure in the case. Pressured by investigators, Moore agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. She called Wuornos while under police surveillance, persuading her to confess to the killings. On tape, Wuornos admitted to several murders, repeating her claim that she acted in self-defense against violent clients. Her trial became a national spectacle. In 1992, she was tried for the murder of Richard Mallory, though evidence from other killings was also introduced. The jury heard not only about the crimes, but also about her troubled past, her years of abandonment and abuse. Yet prosecutors argued that her pattern of taking money, possessions, and cars from her victims showed her true motive. After only a short deliberation, the jury found her guilty of murder and she was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Wuornos faced additional trials for the other murders, each ending in further convictions and death sentences. She became one of the rare women on death row in the United States. Her demeanor in court was unpredictable. At times, she appeared calm and resigned. At other times, she lashed out, shouting at the judge, jury, or prosecutors, declaring her hatred for society and her belief that everyone was against her. Wuornos' story drew wide attention, not just because of her crimes, but because of the complicated questions they raised. Some saw her as a victim of abuse and exploitation, a woman who had been failed by every institution meant to protect her, whose violence was an extension of the violence inflicted upon her. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who preyed on men and used her history as an excuse. Her life and crimes became the subject of documentaries, books, and eventually the film Monster, which dramatized her story. But behind the media portrayal was a woman who lived nearly her entire life in pain, anger, and alienation. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. In her final moments, she gave a rambling statement, referencing outer space, Armageddon, and her belief that she would return. She died quickly, ending a life that had been marked from childhood by violence and instability. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos remains controversial. To some, she symbolizes how cycles of abuse and neglect can create a person capable of great harm. To others, she is remembered simply as a killer who took innocent lives. What is undeniable is that her story stands apart in the history of American crime. A rare example of a female serial killer whose crimes gripped the nation and left behind endless debate about justice, responsibility, and the roots of violence. Her life reminds us how deeply environment and trauma can shape a person, but also how society struggles to reconcile sympathy with accountability. For her victims and their families, the question of motive mattered little compared to the irreversible loss they suffered. For true crime history, the name Aileen Wuornos remains forever etched as both a cautionary tale and a chilling story of violence born from a life of suffering. Next story. The story of John Wayne Gacy begins in the suburbs of Chicago, where he was born in March 1942 to a working-class family. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, life was harsh and unforgiving. His father was an alcoholic with a violent temper who regularly belittled and beat him. His mother, though more nurturing, could not shield him from the constant abuse. Gacy grew up desperate for approval, especially from his father, yet he rarely received anything but criticism. As a child, Gacy suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his physical activity. He often felt like an outsider, excluded from sports, and overshadowed by his father's disdain. But beneath his fragile health and troubled home life, Gacy began developing the traits that would later define him: charm, manipulation, and a hunger for recognition. By his teenage years, Gacy began finding ways to fit in socially. He was known as friendly and eager to help, often volunteering for school and community projects. But his personal life already carried shadows. He struggled with his sexuality, something he kept hidden at a time when homosexuality was harshly judged. His need to maintain a public image while concealing his private desires would become a recurring theme throughout his life. In early adulthood, Gacy drifted into sales and business management, where his charisma proved useful. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and capable of winning people over. But cracks appeared quickly. In the 1960s, after marrying and moving to Iowa, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served time in prison, where he earned a reputation as a model inmate, and was released after serving only a portion of his sentence. His wife divorced him during his incarceration, taking their children and leaving him to start over. When Gacy returned to Illinois, he reinvented himself. He became a contractor, starting his own business and employing local young men. He became active in Democratic Party politics, even posing for photographs with prominent politicians. He volunteered in the community, organizing parties and entertaining children while dressed as Pogo the Clown, a character he created. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed generous and dependable, a man who gave back to his community. But behind this mask, Gacy was living a double life of unimaginable horror. From 1972 to 1978, he lured dozens of young men and teenage boys to his home. Some were employees, others were hitchhikers or runaways, and some simply disappeared after meeting him. Once inside, Gacy used various ruses to trap his victims, including a so-called magic trick where he handcuffed them under the pretense of showing them an escape trick. What followed was torture, sexual assault, and murder. The scale of his crimes would not be fully understood until years later. Gacy disposed of many of his victims by burying them in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. When that space became overcrowded, he began discarding bodies in the Des Plaines River. For years, his murders went unnoticed, hidden by his outward image of respectability and civic involvement. Suspicion began to mount in 1978 after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen leaving work to meet Gacy about a potential job. When police investigated, they quickly connected Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A background check revealed his prior conviction for sexual assault, raising alarm. Detectives began surveillance on Gacy, following him around the clock. As they built their case, they gathered witness statements and evidence linking him to other missing young men. The pressure mounted, and Gacy, increasingly paranoid, began drinking heavily and confiding strange things to friends. In December 1978, police executed a search warrant at Gacy's home. What they found was overwhelming. Beneath the house, investigators uncovered a gruesome burial ground. One body after another was exhumed, eventually totaling 29 victims buried on his property, with additional bodies recovered from the nearby river. The revelations shocked the nation. Gacy, the man who had dressed as a clown for children's parties and mingled with politicians, was now revealed as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The contrast between his public persona and his hidden crimes made the case unforgettable. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial began in 1980 and quickly became a media sensation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including confessions Gacy had made during interrogation and the remains of victims discovered in his crawl space. The defense attempted to argue that Gacy was insane, claiming he had multiple personalities and that one of them, not the man himself, had committed the murders. The jury was not convinced. After a short deliberation, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, one of the highest confirmed victim counts for a single killer in the United States. He was sentenced to death. For more than a decade, Gacy remained on death row, filing appeals and granting interviews. In these interviews, he alternated between admitting guilt, denying involvement, and even blaming others. He painted himself as a scapegoat, a victim of lies, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries, and his final words were defiant, a reflection of the arrogance that had marked much of his life. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is one of horror and betrayal. He was a man who hid his darkest crimes behind the painted smile of a clown, deceiving his community while committing acts of unspeakable violence. His case forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of facades, that a man who entertains children can also be capable of burying their peers beneath his own home. The Gacy murders remain a landmark case in American criminal history, a chilling reminder of how deception and cruelty can coexist within one person. For the families of his victims, the story is not about the bizarre details of his double life, but about the young lives cut short and the years of pain that followed. Even today, the name John Wayne Gacy evokes both fear and fascination, a symbol of hidden darkness and the limits of trust. His crawl space became a graveyard, his home a house of horrors, and his name one of the most infamous in the history of crime. Next story. The story of Richard Ramirez begins on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. From early childhood, Ramirez's life was scarred by violence and instability. His father, a former police officer in Mexico turned laborer in the United States, had a harsh temper. He frequently lashed out at his children, instilling fear rather than guidance. Richard was different from the start, prone to seizures and suffering from head injuries after repeated blows to the head. He struggled in school and became withdrawn. As a boy, he often slept in cemeteries to escape his father's wrath, finding comfort in the stillness of the night. But what might have been a shy, troubled boy soon began sliding towards something darker. A major influence in Ramirez's life was his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who returned home deeply scarred by combat. Miguel shared stories of brutal violence and even showed Richard photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have assaulted and killed. He glorified cruelty, and to a young Richard, these stories became lessons rather than warnings. When Richard was just 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his own wife during a domestic argument. Instead of recoiling from the horror, Ramirez seemed fascinated, absorbing it as part of his twisted education. By his teenage years, Ramirez had begun experimenting with drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD, while developing an obsession with Satanism. He gravitated toward darker influences in music, art, and literature. Petty crime became a routine, and he eventually dropped out of high school. He left Texas for California, where he slipped into a transient lifestyle of theft, drugs, and aimlessness. But behind the theft and wandering, a darker compulsion was growing, a drive for violence and domination. In 1984, Ramirez began what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. His first known murder occurred that June, when he attacked a 79-year-old woman in her apartment, stabbing her repeatedly. Soon, his crimes escalated. Unlike many killers who targeted a specific type of victim, Ramirez attacked randomly. His victims included men, women, and children, ranging from young girls to elderly couples. He would break into homes at night, assault his victims, commit sexual violence, and often kill them with knives or guns. The randomness of his crimes made him uniquely terrifying. No neighborhood felt safe. Families locked their doors, bolted their windows, and slept in fear. The press began calling him the Night Stalker, a name that stuck and magnified the sense of dread. Ramirez reveled in the fear he created. During his attacks, he invoked Satan, leaving behind symbols and shouting phrases that amplified his image as a disciple of evil. He often forced his victims to swear loyalty to Satan or mock their faith. His methods were cruel and chaotic, sometimes shooting his victims, sometimes stabbing them, sometimes bludgeoning them. Survivors described him as tall, thin, with rotting teeth, smelling of decay, and having eyes that radiated menace. By the summer of 1985, California was in a panic. Ramirez's attacks stretched across Los Angeles and later into the San Francisco Bay Area. Communities set up neighborhood watches, police patrols increased, and gun sales soared. The randomness of his crimes left investigators scrambling. But Ramirez made mistakes. He left fingerprints, shoe prints, and eyewitness descriptions. A stolen car he abandoned eventually gave police the evidence they needed. In August 1985, his fingerprint was matched to a prior arrest record, and his identity was released to the public. His mugshot was printed on the front pages of newspapers across California. Only days later, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles and realized that everyone around him recognized his face. Panicked, he tried to steal a car and escape, but the local community chased him down. In a dramatic moment of street justice, a mob of citizens beat and restrained him until police arrived. The reign of the Night Stalker had ended, not at the hands of detectives, but by ordinary people who refused to let him escape. Ramirez was put on trial in 1989 for 13 murders, as well as charges of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The trial was a media circus, drawing massive crowds. Ramirez appeared in court with long hair, dark sunglasses, and a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouting, "Hail Satan." His behavior shocked many, reinforcing the image of a man who embraced evil as an identity. The trial dragged on for years due to its complexity and the number of charges. Survivors and families of victims gave heart-wrenching testimony. Forensic evidence tied Ramirez directly to multiple crimes. Despite his lawyer's attempts, the jury found him guilty on all major counts. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. Upon hearing the sentence, he sneered and told the court that death was nothing compared to the forces he served, declaring that the real terror would come later. Ramirez was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained on death row for more than 2 decades. During his imprisonment, he developed a following of admirers, some drawn to his notoriety, others captivated by his embrace of Satanism. In 1996, he even married a freelance magazine editor who had become obsessed with him. But his life ended not with execution, but with illness. On June 7, 2013, at the age of 53, Richard Ramirez died of complications related to lymphoma while still awaiting execution. The Night Stalker case remains one of the most infamous in American history. Ramirez's crimes were not only about murder, but about terror itself, striking randomly, violating the sanctity of homes, and leaving behind communities paralyzed with fear. He embodied the nightmare of a predator who could come for anyone, at any time, without reason or pattern. For Californians who lived through that summer of 1985, the memory of locking doors, checking windows, and listening for noises in the dark remains vivid. Richard Ramirez left scars not only on his victims and their families, but on an entire state that lived under his shadow. His name has since become synonymous with pure, predatory evil. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the darkest chapters in modern crime history. Born in May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey grew up in a home that was outwardly normal but internally fractured. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, battled her own struggles with mental health. From a young age, Jeffrey displayed signs of detachment from those around him. He was shy, withdrawn, and often preferred to be alone. What stood out to those who later reflected on his youth was a fascination with the dead and with animals in particular. Jeffrey would collect roadkill, study the bodies, and experiment with their bones. At the time, these habits were dismissed as odd, but not alarming enough to demand intervention. As Jeffrey entered his teenage years, his isolation deepened. Alcohol became his companion. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, hiding liquor in the folds of his clothing or stashing it in lockers. His classmates sometimes laughed about it, but his drinking was a symptom of a deeper emptiness that was consuming him. He felt disconnected from people. At the same time, Jeffrey was beginning to struggle with his own sexual identity, and he later admitted that his urges were mixed with fantasies of control and domination. The pivotal moment that marked his first descent into murder came in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. His parents had separated, and Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. One evening, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a young man heading to a rock concert, and he accepted Jeffrey's invitation to stop at the house for some drinks. At first, the atmosphere was friendly, but as the night wore on, Jeffrey realized that Stephen wanted to leave. Panic and desperation filled him because Jeffrey did not want to be alone again. He struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. This was the first murder. Afterward, Jeffrey dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods behind the house. This act haunted him, but it also awakened something inside him that he would later admit he could not control. In the years that followed, Jeffrey tried to appear normal. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after only a few months. His drinking worsened, and his father forced him to enlist in the Army in 1979. Jeffrey trained as a medic in Germany. While stationed overseas, he continued to drink excessively. Some later reports suggested that he may have assaulted fellow soldiers, though these cases were never pursued in detail at the time. By 1981, he was discharged for his inability to function. With no stable direction, Jeffrey drifted between relatives and odd jobs. By the late 1980s, his impulses returned stronger. Living in Milwaukee in a small apartment, Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. At first, he sought companionship, but his fear of abandonment twisted these encounters. He started drugging men to keep them unconscious during their encounters. Eventually, this progressed into murder once again. In 1987, he killed Stephen Twomey in a hotel room after a night of drinking. Jeffrey later claimed he awoke to find Stephen dead without memory of killing him, but this pattern of blackout, followed by violence, would repeat. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer embarked on a spree that would claim 16 more lives. His method was chillingly systematic. He lured young men and boys, often from marginalized communities, with promises of money or photographs. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies for days. In some cases, he performed disturbing rituals of dismemberment and cannibalism. He kept skulls and body parts as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator in a blue barrel filled with acid. His obsession was not only with killing, but with creating a permanent companion who could never leave him. He attempted crude experiments of drilling holes into the skulls of victims and injecting chemicals in hopes of creating a compliant zombie-like partner. Despite the horror unfolding inside his apartment, Jeffrey remained surprisingly unnoticed. Several near escapes highlight the tragic failures of authorities. One of the most striking occurred in May 1991 when a 14-year-old boy named Konarak, sent the sum phone, managed to flee Jeffrey's apartment drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police when they saw the boy wandering incoherently. Officers arrived, but Jeffrey convinced them that Konarak was his adult lover and that it was a private matter. The police accepted this explanation and left the boy in Jeffrey's custody. Within an hour, Jeffrey had killed him. These failures allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes until July 22nd, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Edwards was lured to the apartment, but once inside, he noticed the smell and saw the strange surroundings. Jeffrey attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back and fled through the door. He stopped police officers on patrol and led them back to the apartment. When police entered, they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, and soon after, the full extent of Jeffrey's actions was revealed. The arrest shocked the nation. Neighbors who had complained of foul smells and odd noises were horrified to learn what had been happening next door. The investigation uncovered remains of multiple victims, as well as the tools and containers Jeffrey had used. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled investigators. He openly admitted to the murders, describing his rituals in clinical detail. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many of them were already living in difficult social and economic circumstances and now had to endure the public exposure of their loved ones' deaths. The trial began in January 1992 and drew international attention. Jeffrey pleaded guilty, but insane. His defense argued that his mental illness drove his uncontrollable urges. The prosecution maintained that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he carefully planned his actions. After weeks of testimony, including graphic evidence, the jury found him guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Prison did not bring peace. Jeffrey initially lived quietly behind bars, reading the Bible and speaking to chaplains. Yet other inmates viewed him with contempt. He sometimes mocked guards and prisoners by shaping his food into body parts, as if to relive his crimes. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver beat him to death in the prison bathroom. For many families, this ending felt like a final chapter, though it could never erase the pain. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to stir debates about mental illness policing and the vulnerability of marginalized groups. His crimes revealed systemic failures in law enforcement, who dismissed the concerns of neighbors and ignored the pleas of victims. It showed how predators can hide in plain sight, while institutions fail to protect those most at risk. Documentaries and books continue to analyze the case, but beyond the sensationalism lies the human cost. 17 lives were lost, each with families who still mourn. Story 2. Ted Bundy remains a name etched into the darkest pages of criminal history. Born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in an environment of secrets. His mother, Eleanor, raised him with the support of her strict parents. For a time, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents, and his mother was his sister. The truth of his parents'